Hello, this is Liam Hanlon. This is Neanderthals Were Human. It's part of a wider series of videos I've made. This is part of Evolutionists Say the Darndest Things, and this would be Evolutionists Say the Darndest Things Part 5, but it's more specifically focusing on Neanderthals being human, and the current trajectory of science is telling us that Neanderthals weren't human. They were a separate species, but I've made a series of videos about evolution and how there is no science to back up the theory of evolution, and they have had to separate the human species in the past to fit in with their theory, but I'm about to try and explain and prove that there is no separation between humans that lived now and humans that lived even millions of years ago. There is no separation. The only difference is that we are more technologically advanced now, but that doesn't mean that people weren't humans in the past. They just didn't have the same technology. So this is me on Twitter, and what I'm going to use is people responding to me saying things about evolution, etc. I'll use that to kind of set up a framework for a debate, and part of the series on Evolutionists Say the Darndest Things is also to show you to what depths people will fall to when they're trying to defend the theory of evolution, just simply because that is the accepted scientific theory. They will allow themselves to fall to great depths in their arguments, despite maybe not even having researched any of the things or claiming to be knowledgeable about science, but some of the things that they say are completely unscientific, just simply to support the evolution theory. And again, they might not have even looked at any alternative views or the science behind any alternative views of the world. So this is me saying that evolution is exposed again because Neanderthals exhibited behavioural modernity, meaning they were humans. And I linked to an article about the so-called Neanderthal Man who had a bone multi-tool, which is not. Current science would say that Neanderthals didn't have the intelligence to make a multi-tool, but they did have multi-tools, and they had things that were much more advanced than that also. And behavioural modernity is the current method of proving what a modern human is. And if we can prove that Neanderthals had behavioural modernity, then we also, by extension, prove that they were fully modern humans, the same as you and me walking about today. So what did evolutionists say when I said that Neanderthals were behaviourally modern? So this guy came in and he said, so Homo erectus is the same as Neanderthals? So that's him saying that he's fully immersed in the scientific theory of evolution, which would say that Homo erectus and Neanderthals, there were several species of human, and trying to put my view down by saying that Homo erectus and Neanderthals are clearly different. How can you possibly say anything else? But he doesn't probably know about behavioural modernity and the advanced things that Neanderthals, so-called Neanderthals, could do. So then he said, we must have got into a debate about humans coming from apes, and I would have said that I didn't accept that. It looks like I would have said at some point that humans can't have sex with apes or have children with apes, so therefore they cannot be the same species. And he's saying, no, humans are apes, therefore humans can have kids with a member of apes facepalm. So he's being completely disingenuous there, and what he's saying is that because humans can have sex and have children with humans, he's saying that that is analogous to the fact that humans would be able to have children with apes. So he's being completely disingenuous there, just simply to protect the evolution theory. Then he went on again and he said, all humans are apes, therefore humans can mate with a species of ape. Lol. It was quite hard to figure out what he was talking about at the time. It's only now when I look back I can actually see what he really meant. But again, what he's saying there is that because humans, he's trying to make it analogous that because humans can have sex and have children with humans, therefore they actually can have sex with apes and have children with apes also, or it is equal to that. But as we know, clearly it's not, and he's just being disingenuous. So then I said to him, no, they can't. Humans can't have children with apes. And I referred them to Wikipedia for the human Z, and the human Z is a hypothetical chimpanzee or human hybrid. An unsuccessful attempt to breed such a hybrid was made by Ivanov in the 1920s. There have been occasional reports of human-chimpanzee hybridization, notably regarding a performing chimp named Oliver during the 1970s, but none of them have been confirmed. Similarly, the possibility of a chimpanzee-gorilla hybrid, known as the Kulakamba, also remains unsubstantiated. So what we're getting there is that not only can humans not have sex and make children with any other form of apes, none of the apes can have sex with each other and make a hybrid animal. So orangutans can't have sex with gorillas, chimpanzees can't have sex with gorillas, chimpanzees can't have sex with orangutans, none of them can have sex with each other and create a child, and neither can humans. So not only is the guy wrong about humans being able to have sex and breed with a member of apes, actually none of the ape species can breed together and create a successful child. So that's Oliver, the one that they claimed was. This is evolutionists trying to look desperately hard to prove their theory. So Oliver the chimpanzee was a former performing ape once promoted as a missing link or a humanzee due to his unusually human-like face and a tendency to walk upright. Despite his somewhat unusual appearance and behaviour, scientists determined in the 1990s that Oliver was not a human-chimpanzee hybrid. Research strongly suggests that Oliver was a common chimpanzee from the Gabon region. So there we go. And then to top it all off, a man who was also an evolutionist and defending other evolutionists throughout this debate actually had to come in as well and say, actually, they can't. When this man said that humans can have sex with apes and create a successful child, this guy came in and he said, actually, they can't. And his reasoning for that was that the common ancestor between apes was too long ago, so therefore they had lost the ability to have sex and create successful children. But I don't believe in the theory of evolution, so I don't believe that that ever happened. Humans have always been humans, apes have always been apes, gorillas have always been gorillas, orangutans have always been orangutans. No matter where you look in the animal kingdom, lions have sex with lions and another lion is born every single time. Humans have sex with humans and another human is born every single time. Orangutans have sex with orangutans and an orangutan is born every single time. So there's a big gap there that evolution has to fill and say, well, at what point can an animal have sex with a member of its own species and create a completely different animal, which is what would have had to have happened if evolution was true. So this guy's got himself caught up talking about humans being able to create successful children with members of apes, and his own people from his own community are coming in and saying they can't. Okay, so then that's when I had to say to him, the only thing that proves a human is behavioural modernity. Okay, so his response then, when I said that what makes a human is behavioural modernity, that's a scientific fact. And what did he say about that? He said, no, sorry, species are not defined by their behaviour. And that's when I had to say to him, well, humans are. He was trying to move away from that point because he didn't want to be drawn on that point. But that is a scientific fact that humans are defined by behavioural modernity. So again, let's see the different correspondence of what evolutionists say. So I put this up. Evolutionists exposed again, Neanderthals are behaviourally modern, so therefore they are humans. And then evolutionist came in and he says, oh dear, everybody knows they were human. So this is the article that I was put up about one of the explanations that I had for Neanderthals being behaviourally modern. Were Neanderthals smarter than we thought? 60,000-year-old bone multi-tool suggests cavemen were complex creatures. The tool made from reindeer bone was unearthed in Burgundy, France. It suggests Neanderthals knew how to use bones to make useful devices. This skill was previously only attributed to our species, Homo sapiens. This reduces the gap between the two species and prevents us from saying that one was technically superior to the other. So that's very interesting. It falls on the path of what I'm saying. Neanderthals have a reputation for being lumbering cavemen with low IQs, but a new discovery suggests they may have been more intelligent than we think. A 60,000-year-old multi-purpose bone tool unearthed in France suggests Neanderthals understood how to use bone to make useful devices. This skill was previously attributed to our species Homo sapiens and casts a new light on evolution 250,000 to 28,000 years ago, which is the time that they say Neanderthal Man reigned. This is the first time a multi-purpose bone tool from this period has been discovered, said Luke Dyson from University of Montreal. It was long thought that before Homo sapiens, other species did not have the cognitive ability to produce this type of artifact. This discovery reduces the presumed gap between the two species and prevents us from saying that one was technically superior to the other. The production of bone tools by Neanderthals is open to debate. For much of the 20th century, scientists were reluctant to recognise the ability of this species to use materials like bone in this way, and the reason that they were reluctant to recognise that ancient humans could use multi-bone tools and had the brain capacity to know how to make them and what to do with them is because basically it proves that Neanderthals were behaviourally modern, therefore there is no distinction between modern humans and them. However, over the past 2 decades, a number of discoveries have indicated the use of hand materials from animals by Neanderthals. Our discovery is an additional indicator of bone work by Neanderthals and helps put into question the linear view of the evolution of human behaviour, Professor Dyson said. Evidence of meat butchering and bone fracturing to extract marrow are seen on the tool, and other marks suggest the use of the bone fragment for sharpening the cutting edges of stone tools. Chipping and a significant polish show the use of the bone as a scraper, according to the study. So they've used that bone for many different purposes. They've extracted the marrow from it also, they've ate the meat from it, and that's what it looks like there. Evidence of meat butchering and bone fracturing to extract marrow are evident on the tool. It suggests the use of bone fragment for carved sharpening the cutting edges of stone tools. Now, it doesn't look like much, but in the aspects of behavioural modernity, it proves a lot of things. So I've realised in my past videos that can be a bit demanding of people's time, and I think that I need to kind of set it up for people a bit to entice you into the video. So what you're about to learn is that the only current scientific standard for distinguishing what a human being is behavioural modernity. The things in evolution that they talk about, the ancestors, there is still a missing link in human evolution. There's actually a missing link in all of the animals in the animal kingdom, but it's very, very popularly known that there's a missing link for humans. But what evolution won't tell you is that there is no real scientific evidence for any missing links, and the only scientific standard that we can actually rely on is behavioural modernity. So that you'll learn what behavioural modernity is. You'll see a long list of examples of how Neanderthals were behaviourally modern. You will see how Neanderthals had modern behaviour that is typified in human beings today. So you'll see a lot of what we consider to be advanced in what we do in our normal behaviour today. Neanderthals were also doing that millions of years ago. You will see indications that Neanderthals had advanced technologies that are hard to decipher even for the modern science of today, and you will see evolutionists' claims of what Neanderthals actually are and what they try and say Neanderthals are. So after you've seen what I think Neanderthals are, I'll show you what they are saying that Neanderthals were. So let's go to behavioural modernity now then. Behavioural modernity is a suite of behavioural and cognitive traits that distinguishes current Homo sapiens from anatomically modern humans, hominins and other primates. Although often debated, most scholars agree that modern human behaviour can be categorised by abstract thinking, planning depth, symbolic behaviour, interested in making art and music, exploitation of large game, blade technology, and other things. Underlying these behaviours and technological innovations are cognitive and cultural foundations that have been documented experimentally and ethnographically. Some of these human universal patterns are cumulative cultural adaptation, social norms, language, cooperative breeding, and extensive help and cooperation beyond close kin. These traits have been viewed as largely responsible for the human replacement of Neanderthals in Western Europe, along with the climatic conditions of the last vast glacial maximum and the peopling of the rest of the world. So archaeologically, a number of empirical traits have been used as indicators of modern human behaviour. While they are often debated, a few are generally agreed upon. Archaeological evidence of behavioural modernity are: if you bury your dead, if you fish, if you create art, if you use paint, if you are interested in jewellery, if you use bone for making tools, if you transport your resources over long distances or there is evidence of worldwide trade, if you use blades, if you have diversity, standardisation and regionally distinct artefacts, if you use hearths on your fire, and if you use composite tools. So the list, I suppose, even if you did one of these things, you could be considered as being behaviourally modern. But I suppose you would have to accumulate a few of these things and then you would be considered as behaviourally modern, and I'm going to prove basically as we go through the slides. Now just to return to this guy, this is from a completely different argument, but it's more to concentrate on this part of what he's saying here. So I said that Neanderthals were human, and he says the truth is Neanderthals are our nearest cousin of hominid. So that means that we've got one evolutionist. When I said that Neanderthals were human, he's saying everybody knows they were human. And another guy saying no, Neanderthals weren't human, but they were a different species of hominid. So that means that evolutionists can't actually agree with each other and that they're not actually well researched themselves. They don't actually know what they're talking about amongst themselves. But if a anti-evolution person says something, they'll just jump on the backs of that person and try to get their claws in and try to take them down, even although they're not actually well researched themselves. The evolution theory is obviously not doing its job very well if people who consider themselves to be intelligent are coming up with completely different viewpoints from the same theory and both think that they're correct. So anyway, that was just to let you know the kind of dealings that you get when you're anti-evolutionist in a public forum. There is evidence of Neanderthals doing all of these things. So this is what science is currently saying. Neanderthals were not a subspecies of modern man. Scientists claim structure of nose hints they were a separate species. Anthropologists studied the nasal complex of Neanderthals. They say it has features that evolved separately from modern humans. Neanderthals' extinction was probably due to competition with modern humans, not their inability to adapt to a cooling climate. Research adds to growing body of evidence that the upper respiratory tracts of this extinct group functioned via a different set of rules. The debate that has raged about whether Neanderthals were a subspecies of modern humans may finally be over. Researchers have identified new evidence supporting the growing belief that Neanderthals were a distinct species separate from modern humans and deserve a more distinct identity of their own. Experts studied the nasal complex of Neanderthals to also conclude that their extinction was probably due to competition with modern humans and not their inability to adapt to a cooling climate. So there's a picture of a Neanderthal skull there, and they're saying because it had a different nose, it was a completely different being, not human, not fully human. Experts studied the nasal complex of Neanderthal, a skull dating to 50,000 BC, and say that its features evolved separately to modern humans, suggesting that Neanderthals were a distinct species separate from Homo sapiens. Okay, so what I'm saying is that they weren't, and the reason for their wider nose is because they were humans who had adapted to living in an ice age. Now, I think later on in the slides I'll explain it in a more detailed manner, but your actual DNA can't physically change, but there are DNA switches which can be turned off and on, which would give you a range. Then that gives you a range within that DNA code. It gives you a range of switches that can be selected and turned off and on. So all Neanderthal Man was a human being who was adapted to living in an ice age, and the wider nose was to take in more oxygen in a mountainous environment and in a cold environment where the air is thinner. So the last glacial period, popularly known as the Ice Age, was the most recent glacial period within the Quaternary glaciation, occurring during the last 100,000 years of the Pleistocene, from approximately 110,000 to 12,000 years ago, which falls in when they say Neanderthal Man reigned. Scientists consider this Ice Age to be merely the latest glacial event in a much larger ice age, one that dates back over 2 million years and has seen multiple glaciations. Okay, so during that time period, Canada was nearly completely covered by ice, as well as the northern part of the United States were both blanketed by the huge Laurentide ice sheet. Alaska remained mostly ice-free due to arid climate conditions. Local glaciations existed in the Rocky Mountains and the Cordilleran ice sheet, and as the ice fields and ice caps in the Sierra Nevada in northern California. In Britain, mainland Europe and northwestern Asia, the Scandinavian ice sheet once again reached the northern parts of the British Isles, Germany, Poland, Russia, extending as far east as the Taimyr Peninsula in western Siberia. The maximum extent of western Siberian glaciation was reached approximately 16,000 to 15,000 years ago, and thus later than in Europe, which was 20,000 to 16,000 years ago. Northeastern Siberia was not covered by a continental scale ice sheet. Instead, large but restricted icefield complexes covered mountain ranges within northeast Siberia, including the Koryak Mountains. So basically, let's just say that the North Pole was massive and it's coming down, covering large parts of Canada and America. It's covering probably about a quarter of the northern hemisphere. It's covering the northern European countries, and it's also covering places in Asia. So that's what it looked like in Europe. And that's where they've found a lot of the Neanderthal remains. And I'm saying that's why they had a bigger nose, because they were humans who were adapted to living in an ice age. And just because a gene code can adapt to certain situations doesn't mean that a human can give birth to anything but a human. All animals can live, all animals and all flowers and plants, they can create variety within their genetic code, but it stays within that species, it stays within that genetic code. You can't have, for want of a better phrase, you can't have macroevolution, one species giving birth to another species. Species can only give birth to children that are like themselves. So Neanderthals, named after the valley where they were found, which is in Germany, which is where the Ice Age was, were a species or subspecies of human in the genus Homo, which became extinct between 40,000 and 30,000 years ago. They were close related to modern humans, having DNA over 99.5% the same. Remains left by Neanderthals include bone and stone tools, which are found in Eurasia from Western Europe to Central, Northern and Western Asia. Again, the Ice Age. Neanderthals had a higher volume to surface ratio with shorter legs and a bigger body compared to Homo sapiens, because they inhabited higher latitudes in conformance with Bergmann's rule, and their larger stature explains their larger brain size, because brain size generally increases with body size. Their average cranial capacity was notably larger than average modern humans, indicating that the brain size was larger. So what I'm saying is this is completely consistent with what I'm saying, that Neanderthals were just humans who were adapted to a cold climate, because as we're about to find out now, Bergmann's rule is an ecographic principle that states that within a broadly distributed taxonomic clade, populations and species of larger size are found in colder environments and species of smaller size are found in warmer regions. Although originally formulated in terms of species within a genus, it has often been recast in terms of populations within a species. It is also often cast in terms of latitude, so that's the graph there showing the average body size of a moose, and it goes up as the moose lives in colder environment. The rule is named after 19th century German biologist Karl Bergmann, who described the pattern in 1847, although he was not the first to notice it. Bergmann's rule is most often applied to mammals and birds which are endotherms, that's warm-blooded, but some researchers have also found evidence for the rule in studies of ectotherms such as the ant. While Bergmann's rule appears to hold true for many mammals and birds, there are exceptions. Okay, so human populations who live near the poles, including the Inuits, Aleuts and the Sami people, are on average heavier than populations from mid-latitude, consistent with Bergmann's rule. They also tend to have shorter limbs and broader trunks, consistent with Allen's rule. In 1937, German zoologist and ecologist Richard Hess proposed an extension of Bergmann's rule. Hess's rule, also known as the heart-weight rule, states that species inhabiting colder climates have a larger heart in relation to body weight than closely related species inhabiting warmer climates. So that's all completely consistent with what I'm saying, that Neanderthals were humans, but they were just people who were adapted to living in a cold climate, and we have scientific evidence of that in the Inuits, the Aleuts and the Sami peoples. So Homo sapiens, that's the original bones that they found for Homo sapiens there. There's the skull they found for two different Homo sapiens. Anatomically, modern humans first appear in the fossil record in Africa about 200,000 years ago, and studies of molecular biology give evidence that the approximate time of divergence from the common ancestor of all humans was 200,000 years ago. Okay, so that's what they are saying. That's the current belief in science, right? The current belief in science is that Homo, this evidence here for Homo that you can see, he is the farthest back modern human, okay? And if that was to be disproven and pushed back further, then that would be a big problem for evolution, because it means that anatomically modern humans were living millions of years before they say that humans were even on the planet, and with their theory it takes millions of years for, it would have took millions of years for apes to become man. But if we can push back when modern humans have actually been found, then there's a big problem there for evolution to explain how apes became humans in a very quick way. And so we're about to find that out now, obviously. Mysterious fossils reveal new species of early human. A thick-jawed hominid lived alongside Lucy 3.4 million years ago. So Lucy is the big current evolution evidence that basically saying that Lucy is the first example of a human, an ape coming down from the trees and using bipedal movement. But if we can then say that there was modern humans who lived alongside Lucy, then evolution's got a lot of explaining to do, because it means that modern humans never came down from the trees. That's what it means. So, and now they are finding humans from millions of years ago, but if you go to textbooks and Wikipedia and things like that, they'll still be quoting Lucy as this missing link, but there were already modern humans living then. So let's go into that. Scientists have named the new species Australopithecus dieremeda. Discovery suggests our evolutionary roots are more complex than believed. Several early human species seem to have lived side by side in East Africa. The new species had a thick jaw with small front teeth and thick enamel. Previously unknown species of early human which lived alongside the famous ancestor known as Lucy has been discovered in Ethiopia. Anthropologists studied jawbones and teeth found in the Warsano Millet area and identified them as belonging to a new human which lived 3.4 million years ago. They have named the species, which appears to have dental features previously thought to have appeared much later in the Homo species. So there's the jaw that they found. The discovery suggests the evolutionary roots of our own species and other members of the Homo family tree are far more complicated than had been previously thought, and replace the word complicated with the evolution theory is a failure. The discovery has the potential to radically change our interpretation of the human family tree and suggests that when the first humans began to appear, Africa was a crowded place. Until the end of the 20th century, scientists had believed that there were relatively few early humans living in Africa between 3 and 4 million years ago, and these gave rise to species that came later. Well, they were saying that there was none. However, the discovery of an early human called Australopithecus barlagazzi living in Chad, West Africa, and Kenyanthropus platypops from Kenya transformed this view. So there's another piece of the lower jaw from the new fully modern human that was found to live 3.4 million years ago. There's what it looks like in the cast with the two jawbones together, and there's a scientist Johannes Haile Selassie holding the upper jaw. So let's also look at Australopithecus barlagatzlea. Okay, so Australopithecus barlagatzlea is a fossil hominin discovered in 1995 by the paleontologist Michael Brunet in the Bar El Ghatsal Valley near Koro Toro in Chad, named after the valley where it was discovered. Australopithecus barlagatzalii was dated by beryllium-based radiometric dating as living about 3.6 million years ago. The find consists of a mandibular fragment, a lower second incisor, both lower canines and all four of its premolars still affixed within the dental alveoli. The specimen locality is 2,500 kilometres west of the East African Great Rift Valley, making it far removed from what broadly was thought to be the cradle area of human evolution. Burnet named it Abel. The mandible has similar features to the dentition of Australopithecus afarensis, which fact has caused researcher William Kimball to argue that Abel is not a separate species but falls within the range of variation of the species Australopithecus afarensis. By 1996, Burnet and his team classified as the holotype specimen for Australopithecus barlagatzalii. This claim is difficult to substantiate as the describers, contrary to the International Code of Zoological Nomenclature, have kept the specimen locked away from inspection by the general paleoanthropological community. A barlagatzalii is unique as it is the only Australopithecine found in Central Africa. It is also of great importance as it is the first fossil to show there is a geographical third window that is beyond East Africa and South Africa of early human evolution. So they found a piece of human jaw which would prove that it was exactly the same as a full modern human, and against the Code of International Zoological Studies they're not letting other people inspect that. So that's a second fully modern human that has been found, which lived probably even before evolutionists were saying that monkeys came down from the trees. And there is the jawbone there of barlagatzalii, and it does look completely modern. It does look like any other human jawbone. So the oldest stone tools predate the earliest humans. So let's get into that. The world's oldest stone tools have been discovered. Scientists report they were unearthed from the shores of Lake Turkana in Kenya and date to 3.3 million years ago. They are 700,000 years older than any tools found before, even predating the earliest humans in the Homo genus. Well, they don't really, because we've just shown you they've got evidence of fully modern humans from that time period, and now they've got evidence that those people or people like those people were making tools, but because it doesn't fit with their theory, they don't know what to do with the information. Their theory says that modern humans who could make tools weren't around at this time, but I'm now showing you evidence that modern humans were around at that time, and I'm now showing you evidence that they were making tools, so they were behaviourally modern. They are significantly earlier than anything that has been found previously, said Nick Taylor from the National Centre of Scientific Research in France and the University of Leiden in the Netherlands. It's really quite astonishing to think what separates the previous oldest site and this site is 700,000 years of time. It's monumental. So their estimates, because of the evolution theory taking millions of years for things to happen, this pushes back humans being able to make tools 700,000 years previous to what they thought was possible. So let me try and frame that for you, right? This is 2016. Take you back 100 years to 1916, right? 100 years. And there's a very, very big difference in what is technologically possible between 1916 and 2016. Now, I can't even really imagine what life would have been like in 1916. I can look at pictures of it and I can get a general feel for it, but I still don't really know. So if you think how long 700,000 years is, that's how wrong they were. 700,000 years wrong is absolutely massive. Neither of these species was assumed to be particularly intelligent. They had both human and ape-like features with relatively small brains. However, the tools suggest they may have been smarter than assumed. Obviously they were, but they don't want to commit to that because it doesn't fit their theory. Dr. Ignacio de la Torre from University College London's Institute of Archaeology described this as a game-changing find. It's the most important discovery in the last 50 years, he told BBC News. It suggests that species like Australopithecus might have been intelligent enough to make stone tools, that they had the cognitive and manipulative abilities to carry tasks like this out. So the Australopithecus species is where they say that Lucy falls into, so they're saying that Lucy was basically the first monkey to get out of the trees and walk on hind legs. Now, there's a big difference between being able to walk and then being able to make stone tools, so either way there are big questions in what they're saying, because if Lucy came down from the trees, then its cognitive, its mental capacity didn't evolve in the same line that evolutionists say is possible, because Lucy was basically making tools as soon as she got out of the trees, and what they say, according to the theory of evolution, that wouldn't be true. I think it's more likely, from what I'm saying, is that there was modern humans around at that time, and modern humans had the ability to make tools, and Lucy is just a monkey. That's all that Lucy was. I could show you evidence that Lucy wasn't even bipedal, and what they couldn't actually get Lucy's hip bone to fit together in the way that they thought it should fit together, so they actually used a power saw on it to make it look like it was a bipedal monkey, but it actually wasn't. So I could show you that at some point as well if you want, or you could look into it yourself, but that's true. So Lucy actually wasn't a human. Lucy was just a monkey. They're mistaking it for a human. Okay, so the first tools from this site, which is called Lomenko 3, was discovered in 2011. They were spotted after researchers took a wrong turn as they walked through the hot, dry Kenyan landscape. By the end of 2012, a total of 149 tools had been found, and another field trip in 2014 has unearthed more still. They include sharp flakes of stone sheared off from larger rocks, which were most likely used for cutting. Hammers and anvils were also excavated, some of which were huge in size. The very largest one we have weighs 15 kilograms, which is massive, Dr. Taylor said. On this piece, it doesn't show the signs of actually having been flaked to produce other artifacts. Rather, it was probably used as an anvil. It probably rested in the soil, and the other cobbles brought to the site, which were intended to be smashed apart to make tools, were struck against this large anvil. So again, tool making, I've shown you, is a part of behavioural modernity. So basically, the earliest humans that they're finding were behaviourally modern, and they've been behaviourally modern ever since, so they are human. Okay, again, it doesn't look like much, but that's the anvil that they're talking about. The use of stone tools by our ancient ancestors was until now thought to have originated with the Homo genus around 2.5 million years ago, but the study of a collection of implements pictured in Kenya, which predate this by a staggering 700,000 years, could rewrite what we know about early human history. So this is the timeline of human prehistory. If you go to Wikipedia and you click on the 10th millennium BC, which was 10,000 years before Christ, it'll show you a breakdown of what happened in that 1,000 years, the 10,000th year before Christ. And if you go to 11th millennium before Christ, which was the 11,000th year before Christ, it'll take you to the timeline of human prehistory. So up to 10,000 years ago, they have enough evidence to break it down, but after 10,000 years, would be 12,000 years ago, after 10,000 years before Christ, they don't actually have enough evidence. There wasn't enough things going on to break it down, so it just becomes the timeline of human prehistory, which is split up into the Middle Paleolithic, the Upper Paleolithic, the Neolithic, etc, etc. So they're saying, again, I've just shown you that there are evidence of modern humans much older than Homo, which was 200,000 years ago, but officially on the textbook level here, we're seeing that they are still classing 200,000 years ago Homo as the original human. So this is what the, as I say, when you go into the 11th millennium BC, you actually get just a big kind of description of ancient history. After that, we can break it down better and we can say 10,000 years ago this was happening, 9,000 years ago this was happening, but before 10,000 years ago, 10,000 years before Christ, we don't actually have a detailed knowledge of what was happening in particular time periods, so we've just put it together in broken a whole lot of history down into smaller chunks. So 42,000 years ago, the earliest evidence of advanced deep sea fishing technology at the Jaramalai cave site in East Timor. These are the types of things that were happening in ancient history. So fishing, as we've seen before, is a behaviourally modern thing to do, and 42,000 years ago falls within the time of the Neanderthal Man. So let's see what that actually is when we look into the detail of it. So the Aborigines were actually very good sailors, and they were the first people 42,000 years ago to have evidence of fishing in the deep sea. Not just fishing, but fishing in the deep sea. I can't remember where the Aborigines are considered to have originated from, if they originated in Australia or the Polynesian Islands. Let's just say they started in Australia and then they managed to get to Timor, and they populated Timor also, and they were doing deep sea fishing in the Timor Sea. So in boats 42,000 years ago, they made it 426 miles, which is very, very impressive indeed. And they populated not only Australia, but they populated the Polynesian Islands, and they done deep sea fishing in the Timor Sea. So there's the hooks they were using 42,000 years ago. The world's oldest fish hook has been found unearthed at a site in East Timor, alongside evidence that modern humans were catching fish from the open ocean as far back as 42,000 years ago. The oldest previously known fish hooks are associated with the beginnings of agriculture, which in Southeast Asia was around 5,500 years ago. So previously they thought it was only possible for humans to do deep sea fishing 5,500 years ago, but the Aborigines have evidence of doing that 42,000 years ago. Again, during the same time period as the Neanderthal, when science was saying that man was an ape-like being. The team also found more than 38,000 fish bones at the site, dating the oldest back to 42,000 years ago. Some were from inshore species, but almost half were from pelagic species, fish that dwell in the open ocean, providing the oldest known evidence of humans fishing far from shore. The most commonly found pelagic species at the site were tuna, but there was also evidence of humans eating sharks and rays, among others. So think how hard that would be to fish for a tuna or a shark or a ray. For want of a better phrase, that is pretty gangster, to be out fishing sharks and being the prime predator in your domain. And that takes a lot of forethought, a lot of intelligence, a lot of bravery, a lot of aspects that are behaviourally modern, but humans weren't supposed to be behaviourally modern by this point, according to science. The oldest javelins predate modern humans and raise questions on evolution. The discovery of stone-tipped projectiles in Ethiopia, like the one pictured above, may have been used for striking animals from a distance. The oldest known stone-tipped projectiles have been discovered in Ethiopia. The javelins are roughly 280,000 years old and predate the earliest known fossils of our species, Homo sapiens, by about 80,000 years. So these hunting big game is considered to be behaviourally modern. Science says that it's only Homo sapiens that's capable of that, but we're finding that 80,000 years before Homo sapiens, humans were hunting big game then, 80,000 years before that. So again, evolution's got some explaining to do, because it throws a spanner in the works of the linear progression, the linear evolution model that they prescribe to. Angling for survival. How the pelagic fish were caught isn't known, but the researchers speculate that it was done from boats or rafts using either nets or fibre lines with hooks. That's very modern. The particular hooks discovered by O'Connor and her colleagues don't seem suitable for pelagic fishing, she says, but other types may have been made. Tuna swam too fast for spear fishing to have been successful, she says. Far older fish bones have been found at sites in southern Africa. Those at the Bolombos Cave in South Africa, for example, date from 140,000 to 50,000 years ago, but they have generally been from inshore species whose capture would require less complex technology. A small number of tuna vertebrae have been found, but these can be attributed to scavenging of fish washed up on beaches. Well, how does he know that? So we've got evidence that humans were also doing deep sea fishing 140,000 years ago, but they're saying it was only ever, all the evidence that we have of that is only from fish that came inshore and were scavenged. There's no scientific evidence to say that that is true or not. It could have been scavenged or it could have been caught in the deep sea, they don't know. So there's no point in trying to narrow it down. No one knows. An archaeologist at Stanford University in California who has worked extensively in the region, the oldest known fishing tackle from the vicinity dates from around 12,000 years ago, but it includes only bone gorges and net sinkers, probably used exclusively inshore, he adds. Okay, so there is a big problem with evolution because there are people in the modern world who choose to live a backward lifestyle. Let's say a backward lifestyle. There are people in the modern world who live in tribes. They still live off the land and they don't let any people from the outside in. So what we're saying is that in the modern world, okay, there are people who live advanced lifestyles and there are people who live backward lifestyles, for want of a better word, a tribal lifestyle. Now, that totally disproves evolution just there in one go, because evolution says that there is a constant linear progression from base level form to a more higher form, and there's nothing that you can do about it. It's just part of the progress of genetics. There's nothing you can do about it. It just progresses and there's nothing that can be done about it. But in every single instance, in the Egyptian times, the Egyptians were very advanced, but they also lived alongside people who again lived tribal lifestyles and nomadic lifestyles, and it's still the same today. And what I'm saying is that it's been the same in every single era of man, and some of the people that we're finding evidence maybe of some advanced peoples from millions of years ago, and we're also finding evidence of some people who weren't so advanced millions of years ago. But the crux of what I'm saying is that they were both human. Everyone has always been human. But they're saying, because they're trying to prove this linear progression thing, they're saying that in the past people could only do certain things, but everything that I'm showing you is showing that the people from the past were as behaviourally modern as us. So here's evidence of people in the modern world who choose to live a kind of tribal or nomadic lifestyle. Incredible pictures of one of Earth's last uncontacted tribes firing bows and arrows in a thick rainforest along the Brazilian-Peruvian border. These tribes people are thought never to have had any contact with the outside world. One man points at the plane while the others ready their weapons. Uncontacted Indians emerge, illegal logging blamed. Highly vulnerable uncontacted Indians have made contact with a settled indigenous community. So what would happen if our society was completely wiped off of the face of the earth, but then the only people who survived were these uncontacted Indians here? What would be left of our culture 20,000 years from now, or 100,000 years from now, if man then didn't find any evidence of civilized life and they only found evidence of the uncontacted Indians? They would say, well, these were ape-like beings who had only just came down from the trees. Well, that's definitely not the case. These people are fully human. Some people choose to live backwards or nomadic or tribal lifestyles, and some people choose to live advanced lifestyles, but we are all human and we always have been. Land of the Lost Tribe, the Indian Ocean island that is home to a community who have lived for 60,000 years, but it's too dangerous to visit because they try to kill outsiders, and they deserve a lot of respect for living for 60,000 years in successful lifestyles. So anyway, to move on, I'm showing you the Mohs scale here, which is a scale of hardness of natural minerals. So for example, gypsum, you can scratch that with a fingernail. Calcite, you can scratch that with a copper coin. Talc, you can also powder that with a fingernail. Fluorite, you can only scratch that with a knife or a blade. Apatite, you can only scratch that with a knife or glass. So there is a scale of hardness of the natural minerals in the world, and how they define the hardness is what can it be scratched by, what can cause an abrasion on the surface, and things can only be scratched or cause an abrasion on their surface by something that is harder than the mineral that you are scratching. So what I'm about to show you is probably the first large scale civilized buildings, and they were made from limestone. So limestone is between 3 and 4 on the Mohs scale. So that means if we go back, 3 soft limestone, 3 calcite can only be scratched by copper. Now glass is also harder than limestone, so it could have been scratched by glass or copper, but this particular example of this building, Göbekli Tepe, was actually before the Bronze Age. So according to science, these people made this society, made this building using only stone tools, nothing else but stone tools. But I'm going to show you now that it's impossible. You can hit stone on stone and create a fracture and create something that's very rudimentary, but you cannot create something of an artistic quality. If you are doing limestone, which is what is at Göbekli Tepe, you can only scratch it by a copper coin. Sorry, you can only scratch it by something that is harder, which examples of that would be copper, glass, etc. So here we go, that's some of the things that are in Göbekli Tepe. That's what it would have looked like in its full glory. Now this is some very artistic pieces. There are some very artistic pieces in this settlement, and the type of artistic quality that we have here, and this is before the Bronze Age, before that they say bronze was known and used. And bronze isn't actually finding metal and manipulating metal into something that you want to use. It is a very hard thing to do. You have to analyse your environment and look at the stone and see where you can get iron from or bronze from, the stones. Then you need to break it down, grind it down, then you need to have a really high level furnace, then you need to smelt it, etc, etc. You need to have a blacksmith, you need to have, and it's very, very high tech stuff involving chemistry, engineering, etc. I don't even know the proper names for it right now, struggling to find the proper names for it, but smithery and iron ore and things like that. You need to be highly, highly intelligent and highly skilled to even have metal in the first place. And then the next thing is to actually produce works of art like this is actually amazing. This type of work cannot be produced by hitting stone on stone. It just simply can't. You cannot produce the artistic quality of these things by hitting stone on stone, and according to science and according to the textbooks, it was only stone that was available during the time of Göbekli Tepe. And there's another exquisite piece, could not have been created by hitting stone on stone. There's another exquisite piece. You would have to have something harder than limestone to create something of that artistic quality. Okay, now to change it up slightly, looking at the dog domestication, it was 33,000 years ago, so this is during the time period that the Neanderthal Man is supposed to have died out. So all dogs alive today can trace at least some of their ancestry back to dogs that were domesticated 33,000 years ago in southern East Asia, suggests one of the most extensive ever investigations of canine DNA. In addition to pinpointing the place and time for the earliest dog domestication, the new study published in the journal Cell Research found that the first domesticated dogs descended from grey wolves that likely came from China. The research conducted by an international team further determined that dogs began to migrate out of East Asia and towards the Middle East and Africa 15,000 years ago. They then reached Europe in large numbers approximately 10,000 years ago. It appears that the dogs self-initiated the moves. For some reason, dogs stayed around East Asia for a long time before their migration out of Asia. Senior author Yaping Zhang of the Chinese Academy of Sciences told Discovery News, "We speculated that the glacial period might have been the environmental factor that prevented dogs from migrating out of Asia." So, as I've shown you, there was an Ice Age period during the time of that they say was the Neanderthal Man. It wasn't actually the Neanderthal Man, it was just a set of humans who had lived in the Ice Age for so long that their ancestors had a slightly different nose that was more adapted to an Ice Age environment, and that can happen. There is a range of what can happen within a genetic species, but it cannot change from one species to another. A human will always give birth to a human, and it'll stay like that till the end of time. Nothing will ever change, but you might get a human that's got strong arms compared to someone else, or stronger legs compared to someone else, but you'll never get a human giving birth to something that is an advanced human, a superhuman, or etc, etc. And also, again, the fact that wolves can become a dog. Yes, there are examples of domestication, but what domestication is actually a loss of genetic information. All the animals that can have a genetic range and can become what would consider to be a different animal, it's actually a descent of information, not an ascent of information, which is what evolution proposes. Evolution proposes that information, genetic information, can ascend. It actually can't. It can only descend. For example, the cow is domesticated by man from the auroch. Now, the auroch could survive on its own in the wild, but the cow cannot survive on its own in the wild. If a cow was in the African Serengeti, it would not be able to protect itself from predators, it would not be able to run away, it would not be able to create a home and create a living community, but the auroch could. The auroch could do all of those things. And again, with the dog is probably one of the worst examples, because the dog is actually quite an advanced animal, but it is still less capable of survival in the wild than a wolf is. There are many dogs that they've bred them so far down that they would be completely useless in the wild. Some of the dogs, their coats grow so large that if they did not have a human companion to cut that hair, they wouldn't be able to see anymore, and they wouldn't be able to walk around because their coat would become so heavy. And the reason for that is because a dog cannot actually survive in the wild on its own, whereas a wolf can. All of the examples of domestication of species involves a descent of information where that animal can no longer survive on its own in the wild. So that's not an example of evolution. Even although I'm admitting here that animals can change within a genetic range, they can't actually become a higher animal. Nothing can become a higher animal from what it starts out as. It can become a lesser animal, which is, again, for want of a better phrase, it can become a lesser animal if you choose specific traits. For example, the cow is actually much wider and much thicker because humans want them for their meat. So cows are now big fat animals, whereas the auroch was not a big fat animal and it could live in the wild. So what you're doing with domestication is you're selecting certain parts of the animal that you want to exaggerate, and then that part of the animal is exaggerated, but there's also a blowback from that. The animal can then end up with lots of ailments, it can end up with lots of diseases because it's not natural for the animal to be in that state. Now, the whole point I'm making here is that dog domestication, the earliest example of that might be 33,000 years ago, but you don't just domesticate a dog. You have to analyse your environment first of all. You have to say, oh, there's some wolves there. I could go and get those wolves and I could breed those wolves into something that is more suitable for me as a human being. That takes a lot of intelligence, and that was happening 33,000 years ago. You don't just go from a wolf to a dog within a couple of rounds of breeding. It is something that takes hundreds of years. So even although the earliest evidence of it is 33,000 years ago, humans were obviously thinking about it and doing it hundreds of years before that. So you're so intelligent that you are starting a process that will never be ended by the end of your lifetime. If I tried to domesticate a wolf now into a dog, that process would not be ended by the end of my lifetime. So obviously humans were so smart at that time that they were thinking very, very much far into the future, passing things down to their families and getting their families to finish off the job for them. And it's the same with Göbekli Tepe. You don't just go from being a Neanderthal to all of a sudden you're creating amazing art, you're creating an amazing temple that you want to go and have spiritual enlightenment. This is something that is worked on over decades probably of people who have analysed the environment. They've found out we could go and we could build a spiritual place there. First of all, you would need to have religion for people to even be bothered about that. To be bothered about spiritualism, you would have to have a community that you can share ideas with and bounce ideas off and have a working group that can actually carry out the work. You would need to have community where you would have debates and say, are we going to do this? Are we not going to do this? How are we going to do this? You would need to have artists, people who can actually work on the stone, people who have went and quarried the stone. This isn't something that happens overnight. So even although this building is 10,000 years before Christ, it's actually was probably decades in the making before that also. Okay, 7,500 years ago is when they are saying that copper smelting came into existence, but the Göbekli Tepe is, 2,500 years older than that, and they were quarrying limestone to a high degree and creating artworks on it to a high degree, and that would have took something harder than limestone to do that, one of which would have been copper. Another interesting thing is that the actual wheel, the invention of the wheel, was only 7,000 years ago. So the invention of the wheel was 7,000 years ago, and this was created before. This was created before the invention of the wheel. This. Do you find that hard to believe? I find that hard to believe. So what I'm saying is, this is just an example of the laws, right? Okay, so when do you think the first law was? Well, they don't actually know, because writing was invented after laws were invented. So human beings that, for example, at the Göbekli Tepe, they could have had laws, they could have had courts, they could have had justice, they could have had police, they could have had all these things, but they didn't have any way of writing it down and letting anyone else know. And again, it comes back to motivation. If they could manage their society without writing, then what is the real motivation for them to invent writing? So anyway, this is the proof that laws existed before writing. Urakagina, alternatively recorded as Irikagina, was a ruler of the city-state Lagash in Mesopotamia. He assumed the title of king, claiming to have been divinely appointed upon the downfall of his corrupt predecessor Lugalanda. He is best known for his reforms to combat corruption, which are sometimes cited as the first example of a legal code in recorded history. Although the actual text has not been discovered, much of its content may be surmised from other references to it that have been found. In it, he exempted widows and orphans from taxes, and he compelled the city to pay funeral expenses. So think about the type of society you're talking about: widows, you're talking about taxes, you're talking about funeral expenses, and this was the first time that a legal code was ever written down. You're also talking about corruption, so they must have had a completely well-functioned society before then. They had laws before then, they had taxes before then, they had funerals before then, they had a state before then, but they didn't have any way of writing it down. So this is how complex the past is when you're trying to look at it and say, well, then they invented, as if science is looking back and trying to say that history is linear. It's not. History is not linear. And again, going back to the wheel, just to bring up the kind of the ludicrousness of that, the invention of the wheel falls into the late Neolithic and may be seen in conjunction with other technological advances that gave rise to the early Bronze Age. Note that this implies the passage of several wheelless millennia, even after the invention of agriculture and pottery. So what I'm saying is, when you're at school in the textbook, what they'll probably tell you is that the first inventions ever by man was fire and the wheel, but that's not actually the case. The wheel wasn't invented until after laws had been invented, taxes had been invented, the state had been invented, agriculture had been invented, domestication of animals and plants had been invented, city-states had been invented. Almost everything had been invented before the wheel, and that is actually quite hard to believe. I personally believe that probably the wheel has been in existence for a way longer than that, but they're saying that official wheels that we have found only goes back to the 4th millennium BC, which spans the years 4000 to 3000 BC. So I think that they are analysing history as a linear thing because it suits the evolution narrative, but history isn't linear. The first evidence of wheeled vehicles appears in the second half of the 4th millennium before Christ and simultaneously in Sumeria. The 4th millennium BC spans 4000 to 3000 BC, and that is what they said. This here is what a stone mall is, and that is what they are saying would have been used to have dug out solid rock, and I'm saying that that's not possible. They must have had more advanced tools than that, but that is what the current science and textbooks are saying, that the people at Göbekli Tepe carved out stone using those, and they carved out solid bedrock at Jericho as well using those. But I'm saying that's not possible. They must have had something that is harder than stone according to the Mohs scale. So obsidian is glass, and I think it's a 5 on the Mohs scale. So let's see if obsidian was around at that time for the people at Göbekli Tepe to use. Evidence for earliest obsidian trade found in the Aegean. Researchers studying obsidian tools and weapons discovered at the site of Frankthi cave on the Greek mainland believe they have found evidence that obsidian may have been mined and traded across the Aegean Sea more than 15,000 years ago. Using advanced dating techniques, the scientists found that the obsidian was likely mined from the Aegean island of Melos several thousand years before the end of the last ice age, indicating that prehistoric mariners must have been transporting the volcanic glass stone across the seas. So I'm saying that the Neanderthal man was a human, a modern human with behavioural modernity, but he was more developed through time to live in an ice age environment, and now we're finding that the people who lived around about that area of the world had been mining obsidian, which is a glass, and it's 5 on the Mohs scale, so it could have cut stone. And they're also saying that they had worldwide trade of this obsidian, so this is very, very highly technologically advanced stuff that wouldn't have been done overnight from the end of the Neanderthal man, who supposedly had just stepped down from the trees. They were sailors, certainly, especially in the Aegean region, and they followed little islands jumping like a frog, reaching also Asia Minor and the Greek mainland. So these people were looking at the obsidian that you could get in this Franchitti cave. They were making it into weapons. They realised it had an intrinsic value, and they were going around the world and selling it. That's advanced. That's worldwide trade as behavioural modernity, said Nicholas Laskaris of the University of the Aegean in Greece and one of the project's lead researchers. Until now, only in Franchitti cave obsidians have been found circa 8,500 BC. Now we prove earlier contact with coastal sites was a fact. So science and the textbooks are still saying that people in Jericho and Göbekli Tepe were sitting doing hours and hours and hours of labour cutting out solid bedrock with just a rock tool, but actually they could very well have had access to obsidian by worldwide trade from this Greek island, and we've got evidence of that 15,000 years ago. Just because we've got evidence of it doesn't mean that it's the last example. There could be examples going even further back into the past, but we just don't know about it. That's what obsidian looks like, and again on the Mohs scale there, it's a 5 to 6 on the Mohs scale, so it can cut limestone. That's what obsidian blades would have been looked like when they were fashioned into blades, and it does still look rudimentary, but this is examples of Aztec, some of what the Aztecs done. Arrowheads there, it's very sharp, it will cut you. It looks a bit crappy, I admit, but according to the Mohs scale, this stuff will cut you bad, and I wanted to show you more how advanced some of the blades could have looked. It looks rudimentary and primitive when you see it like that, but this is what it could very well have looked like. This is an example of Aztec blades. See, if someone stabbed you with that, you're a goner, same as a knife, and there's a sacrificial one that was invented for a specific reason, so very cool. We've got evidence of worldwide trade now, indirect evidence of worldwide trade, because the Göbekli Tepe people and the walls of Jericho people were quarrying their stone, and they were cutting their stone to a highly distinct level, and we've now got evidence of obsidian being mined in the Aegean 15,000 years ago, and then that becoming a worldwide trade. So I'm explaining to you that actually is possible using rudimentary tools. The world's oldest temple may have been a cosmopolitan centre. Ancient blades made of volcanic rock that were discovered at what may be the world's oldest temple suggest that the site in Turkey was the hub of a pilgrimage that attracted a cosmopolitan group of people some 11,000 years ago. This is Göbekli Tepe again. The researchers matched up about 130 of the blades which would have been used as tools with their source volcanoes, finding people would have come from far and wide to congregate at the ancient temple site Göbekli Tepe in southern Turkey. So people who had obsidian tools were going to Göbekli Tepe to have spiritual enlightenment, and the blades are made of obsidian and a volcanic glass rich with silica which forms when lava cools quickly. The research was presented in February at the 7th International Conference on the Chipped and Ground Stone Industries of the Pre-Pottery Neolithic in Barcelona. So just because man was living in the ancient past, we're only now starting to piece together that he had worldwide trade, he had obsidian, he had glass tools, He probably had metal tools. But the linear thing about evolution isn't really wanting to highlight any of this, because they don't want the ancient man to have been behaviourally modern. They prefer that the ancient man was an intermediate species between coming down from the trees and becoming the modern man. But I'm trying to prove to you there never was an intermediate species. Man has always been modern. I'm now giving you examples of worldwide trade of glass, obsidian, which could have cut the stone at Göbekli Tepe. And as I'm saying, you don't just invent a place like Göbekli Tepe. It takes hundreds of years for you actually to achieve that. There's lots of things that you would have to have before you could have a Göbekli Tepe. You would have to have a settled society. You would have to have a priest class. You would have to have people who are interested in spiritualism. Being interested in spiritualism and religion is behaviourally modern. All these things, worldwide trade, sailing on the open ocean, it's all things that are behaviourally modern. No other animal looks out onto the open ocean and thinks, I can go out there, I can take a boat out there, I can master that environment. No other animal has the capacity to think like that. But science is saying that the Neanderthal man was a completely different species to human. I'm telling you, that never happened. The oldest obsidian bracelet reveals amazing craftsman's skills in the 8th millennium BC. Researchers from the Institute of Anatolianes in Istanbul and the Laboratory de Tribologie have analysed the oldest obsidian bracelet ever identified, discovered in the 1990s. Having jewellery is also a form of behavioural modernity. Being interested in adorning yourself in jewellery and taking interest in your appearance is behaviourally modern. No other animal looks at itself in the mirror and thinks, wow, how can I make myself look more beautiful? No other animal has the capacity to do that. Only a human can do it, and humans are defined by behavioural modernity. So as soon as you're a human, you're interested in beauty and all these various things that I'm talking about. There was no man that came down from the trees. Discovered in the 1990s at the site of Hoyuk in Turkey, using high-tech methods developed by LTD to study the bracelet's surface and its micro-topographic features. The researchers have revealed the astounding technical expertise of craftsmen in the 8th millennium BC. Their skills were highly sophisticated for this period in late prehistory and on a par with today's polishing techniques. This work is published in the December issue Journal of Archaeological Science and sheds new light on Neolithic societies which remain highly mysterious. They probably remain highly mysterious because of what I'm talking about. Half of them are wiped out, and a lot of the evidence of the coastal communities are gone because they're underwater now. Dated to 7,500 years before Christ, the obsidian bracelet studied by the researchers is unique. It is the earliest evidence of obsidian working, which only reached its peak in the 7th and 6th millennia BC, with the production of all kinds of ornamental objects including mirrors and vessels. It has a complex shape and a remarkable central annular ridge. It's 10 centimetres in diameter, and it was discovered in 1995. Researchers at the colleagues analysed the bracelet using extremely powerful computer technologies developed by LTDS researchers Zuhani and Varugli, developed for industry in order to characterise the orange peel effect on painted car bodywork. These methods, known as multi-scale tribological analysis, have been adapted for the study of microtopographic features on archaeological artefacts. They seek to identify every single operation performed on the surface of these objects. This process has revealed that the bracelet was made using highly specialised manufacturing techniques. The analysis carried out showed that the bracelet was almost perfectly regular. The symmetry of the central annular ridge is extremely precise to the nearest degree and nearest 100 micrometers. This suggests that the artisans of the time used models to control its shape when it was being made, and this is 8,000 years before Christ, and this is supposedly before the invention of the wheel. The surface finish of the bracelet, which is very regular, resembling a mirror, required the use of complex polishing techniques capable of obtaining a nanometer scale surface quality worthy of today's telescope lenses. So what they were doing today in the modern world requires a telescope lens for you to look down to actually achieve this work, and they can do it 8,500 years before Christ. They could do it to the same level. So this totally blows out of the water the idea that evolution is linear, that man constantly moves forward, that all animals constantly move forward. They can't help it, they grow, they get better, they adapt to their environment in better ways. Well, not necessarily, because the ancient humans were extremely complex and extremely capable. Led by Lawrence Astrup, the work was carried out in collaboration with the University of Istanbul and was founded by France's Natural Research Agency as part of the Obsidian Practical Techniques and Uses in Anatolia programme. In the programme, the bracelet is the first object to have been studied among some 60 other polished obsidian artefacts. Paleolithic Weapons Factory was a rich source of obsidian tools from 1.4 million years ago. So they're finding evidence now that obsidian, they were mining obsidian. As I'm explaining to you, obsidian is a 5 on the Mohs scale, so it can cut stone. It is a very dangerous weapon. Scientists call Mount Arteni in Armenia an extinct volcano that has rich deposits of obsidian, a Stone Age weapons factory, they say, from about 1.4 million years ago, so that's older. Humans were manipulating obsidian and creating it into weapons, and they had the intelligence to analyse that 1.4 million years ago, which is much older than the supposed earliest form of man. The earliest form of man, the scientists and textbooks will tell you, is 200,000 years ago. But we've got examples of humans having so much knowledge about their environment that they're going to places where obsidian forms and they've got a factory of weapons and probably jewellery and things like that as well. Homo erectus people and later Homo sapiens made obsidian tools, they are numbering in the millions. I have little doubt that members of the genus Homo were using Armenian obsidians for as long as both were around. So that means that Ellery Fram doesn't actually believe in evolution then, because if he's saying that for as long as humans have been around they've been manipulating obsidian for their own personal uses, then that means that man has always been behaviourally modern, and as I'm explaining, there is no intermediate species. Homo erectus fossils were found in 2013 relatively close by in Georgia. Scientists said these were the earliest human fossils found outside of East Africa, dating back 1.8 million years. Armenian archaeologist Boris Kasparian told National Geographic Mount Arteni was a gigantic open-air workshop where innumerable arrowheads, spearheads, hand axes, blades, scrapers and chisels were made. These tools circulated through an exchange route that predate by millennia the oldest known formal trade activity. So if they were making chisels, then they probably did have the intention to manipulate stone. You could easily manipulate stone with an obsidian chisel. In fact, obsidian is such an excellent material that some surgeons actually still use obsidian scalpels. And also we've got examples of a trade route here. 1.4 million years ago we've got examples of humans manipulating their environment for their own needs and having a trade route, which again is behavioural modernity if you've got example of worldwide trade. Equipped with new technology that can precisely identify the origin of obsidian tools, even down to a single lava vein in a specific volcano, scientists have come to believe that Arteni was a central component in what amounts to a far-reaching Paleolithic arms industry. Its products have been traced north over the Caucasus to present-day Ukraine and west across Anatolia to the Aegean. So there we've got now obsidian. When I was saying to you that the Aegean, people using obsidian in the Aegean, there's evidence that they had worldwide trade from there by skipping on the Mediterranean islands and then going on into Asia. We've now actually got evidence of that happening 1.4 million years ago. Worldwide trade is behaviourally modern, and so is hunting for large game. So if you're hunting for large game, then you're going to want an obsidian blade. So they were transporting this stuff 1,600 miles away and selling it. I mean, this is a real big slap in the face to the evolution model. Estimates of Arteni's output are staggering. Active production is thought to date back to the Lower Stone Age, when the region's first skilled artisans were early Neanderthals. Their successors mined the same materials up to 1000 BC. Gasparian and his Armenian associates, along with their American, Japanese and European collaborators, have harvested thousands of Paleolithic tools at Arteni and other local sites. Gasparian said that through the ages, people both pre-Homo sapiens and sapiens produced millions of tools at Mount Arteni. He said it is impossible to count the number. Because Armenia was a Soviet satellite, archaeology work stopped for a time near the end of the collapse of communism in Europe. By 2011, archaeologists were finding 500 pieces of worked obsidian per day in Armenia. This is gangster. This is very, very gangster. These people were doing all the things that I mentioned previously. Worldwide worldwide trade, masters of their environment, having the ability to look at something and realise how hard it is, what you can do with it, creating blades with it, creating tools. This isn't easy to do. A Neanderthal couldn't do it. Only a modern human can do it. But the very fact that these people are doing this means that they cannot be classed as Neanderthals, because Neanderthals weren't behaviourally modern according to science, and they were a completely different species. If you're behaviourally modern, it doesn't matter what you look like, you're a human. If a computer could do all the things that a human could do, you could say that it was behaviourally modern. If an alien came down and it could do all the things that a human could do, it would be considered behaviourally modern. If an animal could somehow do all of the things that a human can do, it would be considered behaviourally modern. Guess what? Neanderthal was human because he was behaviourally modern. They know the obsidian found more than 1,000 miles away is from Arteni, from chemical traces in the mineral. Scientists can even tell which seam the stone came from, so obsidian that was made at Arteni and quarried there and cultivated there and shaped there found its way 1,500 miles away. So this is how to cut and polish obsidian, just to give you a clue about how complex it is. Obsidian is a natural glass formed from volcanic activity in the same way as granite. So in the modern times, this is how we polish obsidian, and we have examples as I showed you in that bracelet. How long was that bracelet ago? 8,500 years ago. So they're saying that 8,500 years ago people had the same skills as what they have now, even as much as down to the telescopic lens. So this is what they do in the modern times to shape obsidian. This is how they polish it with that kind of machine there. This is how they slice it. They slice it with a diamond saw. And that is how they cut and polish it with a big kind of belt, sanding belt thing there. And 8,500 years before Christ, people could create the same level of high-tech jewellery as what we can create now. Now, even older than that, again, I'm saying this is to prove that there is no linear form of man. Just because you can find something doesn't mean that it's the oldest example of that. It's just currently the oldest example that you have found. And it doesn't mean that before that people were Neanderthals and they had just came down from the trees and they were grunting to speak to each other. That's not based on anything. Incredible 40,000-year-old bracelet believed to be the oldest ever found suggests that the ancient human race used drills which were just like modern tools. It was discovered inside the Denisova cave beside ancient human remains. Scientists say there is evidence that the bracelet's maker used a drill. Nowhere else in the world has evidence of the early technology been found. Other cave finds include the bones of a woolly mammoth and a woolly rhino. So you wouldn't have to have an electric drill, you could have a hand-powered drill, okay? So someone has made that 40,000 years ago during the time of the Neanderthal, which proves that humans then were behaviourally modern. They weren't Neanderthals. A unique green stone bracelet discovered beside ancient human remains in a Siberian cave is the oldest ever found, dating back around 40,000 years, say Russian experts. The intricate modern-looking piece of polished jewellery, perhaps belonging to a prehistoric princess, was made of chlorite by the Denisovians, a long-extinct early human grouping, it is believed. Again, they're saying that the Denisovians weren't fully human, they were a different species of human, but if they were interested in jewellery, if they were using drills to make jewellery, if they had princesses, then they were behaviourally modern. This is all behaviourally modern stuff. So therefore you can't say that they were different to modern humans. You can't say that they were a different species. The remarkable bracelet was found in the Altai mountain range in 2008, but it is only now that pictures have emerged showing it in all its glory, including a reconstruction of how it would have looked at the time. Experts who have spent years examining the bracelet say evidence suggests it was an exceptionally rare item of the era and likely held great significance for the wearer. In addition, the level of skill and expertise required to create the piece has led to speculation that these earliest humans were more technologically advanced than previously thought, with the Denisovians seemingly more skilled than Homo sapiens or Neanderthals. So now all of a sudden an ancient human species is more skilled than the Homo sapiens, which is what you and I supposedly are. Scientists found that a hole had been drilled in part of the bracelet with such precision that it could only have been done with a high rotation drill similar to those used today. It was carefully polished with a heavy pendant added in the centre, probably hanging from a short leather strap, yet the archaeologists have ruled out that the bracelet was made in a later era and buried with the earlier Denisovian remains. Scientists also noted it was made of chlorite, a stone found more than 150 miles away, suggesting the bracelet was of significance at the time. This unique jewellery is currently held at the Museum of History and Culture in the Peoples of Siberia. But this item, given the complicated technology and imported material, so worldwide trade, obviously belonged to some high-ranking person of that society. In bright sunlight it reflects the sun rays, and at night by the fire it casts a deep shade of green. But what puzzled experts was the way the jewellery had been made, and it remains far from clear how the primitive human species could have created it. Dr. Derevyanko said there is a drilled hole with a diameter of about 0.8 centimeters. Studying it, scientists found out that the speed of rotation of the drill was rather high with minimal fluctuation, and there was applied easel drilling technology that is common for more recent times. The ancient master was skilled in techniques previously considered not characteristic for the Paleolithic era. Yeah, you're not kidding. The Institute's deputy director Mikhail Sunkov said the bracelet was found in the same layer inside the cave with proven remains of Denisovians. He said that nowhere in the world had such technology been used at such an early time. Well, that's our only evidence of it, but it doesn't mean that was the only place that it was happening. And you can call them a Denisovian and you can give them a fancy name, but obviously they were behaviourally modern. So let's just go on quickly now to get a more complete picture, just a kind of quick complete picture of how advanced people could have been and how similar they are to us now. So they found sex toys that date back to, possible sex toys dating back to 28,000 years. Ancient phalluses made from stone and dried camel dung started the trend for sex aids. A siltstone phallus found in Germany is said to date back to 28,000 years. It is quoted as being the oldest known sex toy ever discovered. Phalluses made from stone, wood, leather and even camel dung have all been found during excavations or referenced in historical text and images. A 28,000-year-old phallus found in Germany recently, for example, is quoted as being the oldest known sex toy ever found, while phalluses made from stone, wood, leather and even camel dung have all been found during excavations or referenced throughout historical text and images. So there it is there, and the 28,000 years ago was within the time of the Neanderthal Man. And if you're talking about sex toys, then you're talking about sexual pleasure and you're talking about having an orgasm. Sexual gratification for women is something that modern human beings think has only existed since probably about the 80s. But if we're talking about Neanderthal Man possibly giving his wife sex aids from 28,000 years ago, then it shows that they weren't thinking about that. They're talking about sexual pleasure and having orgasms 28,000 years ago. Were Neanderthals master tacticians? Early human relatives used meticulously planned strategies to hunt Ice Age beasts. Forensic analysis of hunting sites has revealed Neanderthals' tactics. They used the landscape to funnel fleet-footed prey towards bottlenecks. They were then able to ambush them and kill almost indiscriminately. Neanderthals then only chose to butcher the best animals for meat. With their heavy, thick-set bodies and slow-witted reputation, Neanderthals are thought to have been fairly cumbersome hunters, but new forensic analysis of the hunting grounds where these prehistoric human relatives are known to have killed their prey has revealed they were in fact brilliant tacticians. Researchers have found evidence that Neanderthal hunting parties used the landscape to give them the advantage over their fleet-footed prey. Neanderthals, however, were much more heavy-built than their Homo sapien cousins and are thought to have been slow. Instead, it appears they herded their prey, which were often large herbivores like reindeer, horses, rhinos and bison, into areas where they could easily ambush them. They describe Neanderthals as being careful tacticians, casual executioners and discerning diners. For the study, the scientists examined several sites where large collections of Ice Age animal bones have been discovered and are thought to have been victims of Neanderthal hunts. So hunting large game is a part of behavioural modernity. So what they're saying here is that the Neanderthal man was the king of his terrain and basically just ran and funneled animals into certain spots where it was easier for them to kill. So here we go here, the bison hunting site, the Garonne Valley. The researchers analysed several sites thought to be Neanderthal hunting grounds, including one where bison had been killed in Garonne, France. Here it appears the Neanderthals drove the animals up against a limestone escarpment where they trampled each other in panic and were easier for the Neanderthals to kill. So Neanderthals are chasing them and funneling them into this bit here, up against this wall, and then just running in and killing them however they liked. So, these were not people who found it hard to kill large game, which is a part of behavioural modernity. The Neanderthal diet. A recent study revealed Neanderthals snacked on a wide range of meats, but a fifth of their diet consisted of plants. Fossils taken from excavation sites in Belgium, Grotte de Spy or Spy Cave, revealed a vast array of animals lived there 45,000 to 40,000 years ago. Bones of mammoths, woolly rhinos, wild horses, reindeer, European bison, cave hyenas, bears and lions, as well as the remains of wolves, were found alongside the remains of Neanderthals. Based on isotope studies of the collagen found in the Neanderthal bones, the researchers were able to show that their diet was markedly different from that of other predatory animals. They appear to have primarily fed on large herbivorous mammals such as mammoths and woolly rhinoceroses. Studies of the isotope composition of individual amino acids in the collagen also offered proof that plant matter constituted approximately 20% of their diet. So, as I said, hunting wild game is a part of behavioural modernity, and Neanderthals are killing mammoths, rhinos, horses, reindeer, European bison. They are totally holding it down. They're doing everything, and have the 20% of their diet is plants. There'll be a lot of people in the modern world now that don't have 20% of their diet as being plants, so they were clearly healthy and they clearly knew what they were doing. For example, they found that an assemblage of 4,150 bison bones from 137 individuals found in Muran, France, appeared to be a post-rut feeding ground when they were killed. So Neanderthals were killing. Actually, you would probably think from looking at textbooks that Neanderthals were struggling to maintain their diets. Well, actually they weren't. They were killing a mass surplus of meat. So hunting tactics used by Neanderthals: the bison, they used topography as a natural trap. They exploited their flight behaviour. In the butchery, they only chose the choicest fat fillets and the rump. Well, I won't go through it all, but what I find interesting is the butchery. So they're saying selection of the finest meats, selection of the largest and fattest individuals, so they know how the animals were going to react. They exploited their flight behaviour, killed them easily, killed a surplus of their meat, and then butchered them to a very high standard. This is what Neanderthals were doing and could do, so therefore they were behaviourally modern and they weren't a different species. Neanderthals were expert butchers. Ancient hunters only took the choicest cuts from mammoths. Bones reveal animals were found at a Middle Paleolithic site in Quinciaux, France. They belong to mammoths, woolly rhinos, horse, bison and reindeer. The bones are between 33,000 and 55,000 years old. Archaeologists from INRAP believe Neanderthals may have butchered large herbivores, only carrying the meatiest parts back to their homes. This is because long bones were not found with the carcasses, so they weren't taking their spines away or unnecessary parts of the animal. They were killing them on site and then cutting them up on site and only taking away the big meatiest parts. Bones of large animals discovered in southwest France suggest that Neanderthals were more sophisticated at hunting and gathering than previously thought. Our ancient cousins may have butchered the bodies of animals such as mammoths and bison, only carrying the meatiest cuts back to their caves. French archaeologists came to this conclusion because long bones were missing from the carcasses of many of the animals found at the site in Quinciaux. Neanderthals lived at the site between 35,000 and 55,000 years ago. They also found the skull of a cave bear and several wolf bones. The experts think that all the bones belong to animals that were deliberately hunted or scavenged by Neanderthals who used the carcasses. Some of the bones have cutting marks showing they were butchered. The archaeologists noted a lack of long bones, which they believe shows that only the meat-rich parts of the bodies were carried back to the home. They think poorly preserved site may have been a carcass processing area, so they were very, very successful hunters and they knew exactly what they were doing and they were behaviourally modern. Neanderthal mothers breastfed their babies for over a year, just like humans. Researchers analysed the tooth of a 10 to 12-year-old child that lived in a cave in Belgium about 100,000 years ago. They found it was breastfed exclusively for 7 months, followed by a 7-month supplementation. Neanderthals breastfed their babies for over a year, just like humans, according to new research. Chemical analysis of a juvenile's tooth revealed it was reared on mother's milk for 7 months, with suckling continuing for the same period coupled with solid food. The change from breastfeeding to plants and grains can be established by looking at differences in the distribution of barium in teeth enamel. This enabled Dr. Manish Arora and colleagues at Mount Sinai School of Medicine to discover the early life diet of a 10 to 12-year-old child that lived in a cave in Belgium around 100,000 years ago. So caring for the sick and caring for the young is something that's behaviourally modern, and they were feeding their humans exactly as we do now. So they're no different, and they weren't a different species. Did Neanderthals invent bling? The world's oldest jewellery, made from eagle claws, was worn by human relatives 130,000 years ago. 8 eagle talons were found at a site in Croatia inhabited by Neanderthals. They had cut marks that suggest they had been strung together with sinew. The claws cut from the feet of a white-tailed eagle have also been polished. Anthropologists say it is the oldest example of jewellery to be discovered. They say it suggests Neanderthals used them for symbolic purpose. They predate the arrival of modern humans in Europe by 80,000 years. Well, they don't, because they were modern humans, because adorning yourself with jewellery is modern human behaviour, behaviourally modern. So they weren't a separate species. It's the only scientific way that we can say what a human is through behavioural modernity. And as I'm going through these slides, you're finding yourself that Neanderthals were behaviourally modern. This contradicts traditional views of Neanderthals as primitive and stupid. Scientists say they were in fact sophisticated and had sophisticated culture. Cavemen didn't grunt. Scientist says early human speech evolved rapidly into complex sentences. Professor Miyagawa notes single words bear traces of syntax. He says this shows the words came from an older, syntax-laden system. He believes humans combined an expressive layer of language, as seen in birdsong, with a lexical layer, as seen in monkeys. In a new study, one linguist argues that human language developed rapidly, with people quickly using complex sentences that sound like our own. The hierarchical complexity found in present-day language is likely to have been present in human language since its emergence, says Miyagawa, professor of linguistics at Massachusetts. Most scholars believe that humans first started using a proto-language, which was a primitive kind of communication with only a gradual development of words and syntax. But according to Professor Miyagawa, single words bear traces of syntax, showing that they must be descended from an older, syntax-laden system rather than from simple, primal utterances. So that combines with what I'm saying. I'm saying that humans are a part of infinity, and they have lived on this planet in various guises for all eternity, and they may have suffered extinction events, and they may have had to live in very, very tough time periods, but they've always been there. So what he's saying is that all speech basically comes from a previous syntax-laden system, so it makes sense that the language that we have now is just basically copied from the older language that existed before, from the people before. And that does make sense, because where language comes from is actually described as the hardest question in science. No one actually knows where human language came from or originated from. Since we can find syntax within words, there is no reason to consider them as linguistic fossils of a prior pre-syntax age, he adds. In his paper, Professor Miyagawa writes that a single word today can be internally complex, often as complex as an entire phrase, making it less likely that words we use today are descended from a pre-syntax mode of speech. So he's saying words are so complex that they cannot be, you can't boil them down to a common denominator. words are complex within themselves and sentences are complex. You can't regress from that, and that's what I'm saying with human species and all the species in the world as well. You can't, although evolution is saying that there are transitional forms for every single animal on earth, there is no evidence of any transitional forms for any animal, and I'm saying that every single animal has irreducible complexity. You can't take a whale and then go back from that. Everything that a whale has, it needs it for its daily survival. Everything that a human has and a human can do, we need it all for our daily survival. Everything that a giraffe can do, it needs all of its aspects to be a giraffe and to survive as a giraffe. It's so complex that you can't step back from that, and it's the same with language. Language is so complex that you can't actually step back. There is no pre-syntax speech. Nationalisation, the word nationalisation for example, starts with nation, a noun, adds al to create an adjective, adds is to form a verb, and ends with shon to form another noun, albeit with a new meaning. So that's how complex just an individual word can be. Hierarchical structure is present not only in single words but also in compounds, which, contrary to the claim of some, are not the structureless fossilised form of a prior stage, he says. The oldest dentistry is found in a 14,000-year-old tooth. Evidence of the world's earliest dental operation has been discovered by scientists in the 14,000-year-old skeleton of a caveman suffering from toothache. Researchers in Italy discovered that a flint tool called a microlith was used to file away a rotting cavity to halt infection, just like a modern dentist's drill. The find represents the oldest archaeological example of an operative manual intervention on a pathological condition, according to Stefano Benazzi, a paleoanthropologist at the University of Bologna. The treatment went unnoticed for all these years. The cavity was described as a simple carious lesion, Benazzi said. Detailing their finding in the journal Scientific Reports, Benazzi and colleagues show that forms of dental treatment were already adopted in the late Upper Paleolithic. At that time, toothpicks, probably made of bone and wood, were used to remove food particles from teeth. A beeswax dental filling was discovered in a 6,500-year-old human tooth from Slovenia, while dental drilling likely to remove the decayed tissue was discovered in a 9,000-year-old molar from a Neolithic graveyard in Pakistan. So Neanderthals are finding their teeth, they're having complex sexual interactions, they're adorning themselves with jewellery, they're having obsidian weapons, they're creating stone structures that weigh over 50 tons, they're creating magnificent art, they know how to do astronomy, they know how to do maths, they know how to do chemistry, they're doing dentistry. What can they not do? How are they not modern humans? And there is what the dentist drill would have been like. Cereal was a staple diet in the Sudan 7,000 years ago. Neolithic teeth reveal traces of grains centuries earlier than first thought. Humans in Africa were harvesting and eating cereal 7,000 years ago, several centuries earlier than previously thought. The discovery was made after researchers found ancient barley and wheat residues on teeth of skeleton from Neolithic cemeteries in Sudan and Nubia. It is believed wheat was first cultivated in the Middle East about 10,500 years ago and spread out there to Central and South Asia as well as to Europe and North Africa, the latter faster than expected. So I know that there's a creeping expansion here going on when I'm telling you that Neanderthals weren't human, but now we're up at 7,000 years ago, and we know that 7,000 years ago people were human, and the Neanderthals supposedly died out about 28,000 years ago. But what I'm saying is that wheat was first cultivated 10,500 years ago, but it didn't turn up as cereal until 7,000 years ago. So that's how long it actually takes for some things to be achieved. And especially now in the modern world where we've got so many technological advancements, we can achieve things much quicker, but then they couldn't achieve things extremely quickly. The things that they were working out, agriculture and the crossbreeding of plants, is far more complex than someone now who would maybe come along and invent a new type of energy, limitless energy, something like that. The person who's inventing limitless energy has got computers, science, previous knowledge. These people had nothing, and they they figured out how to crossbreed plants and create successful cereals for themselves and successful diets for themselves. So they lived in a much, much harsher environment, and that's why it took them quite a long time to create things, but they were fully modern humans. They were behaviourally modern. So this guy here, in a good comment that I found, is basically talking about the same thing that I am. He's saying it is still puzzling that a pre-literate hunter-gatherer should, after a couple of 100,000 years of technical stasis, because humans are supposed to be from 200,000, the modern human is supposed to be from 200,000 years ago, suddenly realise that by selectively breeding virtually inedible grasses over many generations that the result would be an edible crop. How did they manage that 7,000 years before Google? So he's saying basically what I'm saying, that I'm actually saying that modern humans are from millions of years ago. That's the earliest examples that we have found. But I'm actually saying no, further than that. I'm actually saying that the earliest humans that we have found are the people who survived an extinction event, and that there was also humans before that. And this is just to give you an aspect of how their daily lives, people from ancient past, their daily lives were no different whatsoever to the lives that we live now. They just don't have access to as many technological advancements. Stonehenge's builders feasted on yogurt, cheese and hog roasts. Pottery analysis reveals the diet of stone circles makers 5,000 years ago. Stonehenge's builders were not slaves, but instead willing workers who enjoyed the perks of feasting on dairy and meat. Archaeologists have revealed analysis of pottery shards found near the stone circle has revealed that the containers once contained yogurt, cheese and milk. Pig and cow bones, by contrast, were eaten further away and consumed in large open-air barbecues. Further research by the University of Sheffield found that many pigs were killed before reaching their maximum weight. The archaeologists believe this is strong evidence of planned autumn and winter slaughtering and feasting like consumption. The ancient Britons preferred to boil and roast meat in pots around indoor hearths, as well as large barbecue-style roasts outdoors. The site showed that there were bones from all parts of the animal skeleton, which suggests livestock were herded to the site rather than transported there as joints of meat. Chemical analysis of the bones show that the animals came from many different locations, including some as far away as Cornwall, Wales and Scotland. The archaeologists write this is significant as it would require orchestration of a large number of volunteers drawn from far and wide. The observed patterns of feasting do not fit with a slave-based society where labour was forced and coerced, as some have suggested. So they were having barbecues, they had extensive relationships with people very far away from them. They were eating yogurt, they were eating dairy, they were eating meat, they were slaughtering animals based around feasts, and that was the people that made Stonehenge. And they were eating cereal 7,000 years ago, and then on top of all the other previous things I've been talking about, these people were advanced. So this is in contrast to what I'm saying, right? In contrast to what I'm saying, that man has always been capable, man has always been man, humans have always been humans. I'm only saying man because it's easier to say man, but I'm definitely including women in that as well. I'm not being exclusive. Okay, so this is what the evolutionists are saying in comparison to what I'm saying. Now I've showed you basically all the complex things that ancient humans were doing and could do, including the Neanderthal man. This is what science is saying. Man learned to throw 2 million years ago. Well, I've shown you at the start of these slides examples of modern humans being born 3.5 million years ago. That's admitted by science, but they're saying that it took man 1.5 million years to be able to learn to throw. Do you believe that? Do you believe there was ever a time where man couldn't throw? So change to the collarbone and shoulders allowed human ancestors to use spears. Scientists compared the shoulders of Homo erectus with modern humans. The researchers from the George Washington University measured the throwing ability of people from the Dasanch tribe in Kenya and Ethiopia. Dasanch people could throw sticks at 80 miles an hour over more than 100 metres. The scientists found that Homo erectus would have had similar abilities. Homo erectus could have rivaled modern athletes in their throwing ability. Early human ancestors may have evolved to throw spears, allowing them to hunt 2 million years ago. Scientists have found that the skeletons of the early humans changed to give them the ability to throw like modern humans. A study of fossils of Homo erectus, an extinct human ancestor, shows that their shoulders and collarbone would have allowed them to hurl sticks accurately and powerfully. So science is saying that there was a large part of man's existence where he couldn't even throw. I don't believe that. What I can tell you is Lucy, for example, Lucy is the species that they have defined as being the species, example of the species that came down from the trees. But see, as we look into the past, all they have ever found is either a human or a monkey. That's all they have ever found, and Lucy was a monkey. And there is even YouTube videos, you can go and look it up yourself, where Lucy wasn't even bipedal, couldn't walk standing up, and they were having problems with that, with the hip bone. So what they did was they actually used a power saw. The hip bone wouldn't fit together in the way that they wanted it to fit together, so they used a power saw to saw it down and fit it together the way that they wanted it to fit together with Lucy. And you can look that up for yourself. Lucy was a monkey and it wasn't a human, and all that we have evidence of is either animals that were monkeys or animals that were humans. And what I'm saying is, humans have always been humans, they've always been behaviourally modern, and they could always throw. Now this is what they're finding out now, is that we are actually, because we've lived sedentary lifestyles for so long, what I'm saying about there is a certain amount of genetic variation within a species, but it can't change from species to species. We have lived sedentary lifestyles for so long that we are actually far, far weaker than the so-called Neanderthal man and the ancient humans. And that is a big question that evolution would have to answer. So how modern humans have become weaklings compared with our ancient ancestors who could outrun and outlift today's top athletes. Human leg bones have grown weaker since farming was invented. Scientists found bone structure declined after agriculture emerged. Male farmers 7,300 years ago had legs of cross-country runners, but just 3,000 years later they had legs comparable to sedentary students. Mo Farah would have had some tough competition from ancient farmers living 7,300 years ago. Scientists claim if they were to cross paths, our ancestors would have been capable of outrunning some of the world's most talented athletes. That's according to recent research by Cambridge University, which reveals just how far our fitness has fallen in a couple of millennia. Even our most highly trained athletes pale in comparison to our ancestors. We are certainly weaker than we used to be. So we're weaker than we used to be, but evolution is saying at certain points humans couldn't even throw. It then compared the bones to that of Cambridge University students and found the leg bones of male farmers 5,300 BC were just as good as those of highly trained cross-country runners, but 3,000 years later the study found our ancestors had leg bone structures closer to that of the Netflix generation. Macintosh used a portable 3D laser surface scanner to study the femurs, tibiae, shin bones of skeletons from Germany, Hungary, Austria, Czech Republic and Serbia. She found that male tibiae became less rigid and the bones of both men and women became less strengthened to loads in one direction more than another. Bone mass was found to be about 20% higher in foragers, the equivalent to what an average person would lose after 3 months of weightlessness in space. Okay, there's a man who's wrote a book and he's saying that ancient man would have been faster than Usain Bolt and stronger than Arnold Schwarzenegger. In his book Manthropology, The Science of Inadequate Modern Man, Peter McAllister says that a Neanderthal woman would beat Arnold Schwarzenegger in an arm wrestle. In a javelin contest, the Aborigine would claim the gold medal. The world record is 98.4 metres, but they could throw a spear a staggering 110 metres. He said, as a class, we are in fact the sorriest cohort of masculine Homo sapiens to ever walk the planet. His conclusion about Aboriginals' astonishing speed comes from analysis of 20,000-year-old footprints preserved in a fossilised clay pan lake bed in Australia. The prints are of 6 men chasing prey, and Mr. McAllister's study of them leads him to believe that they could hit 23 miles an hour on muddy ground. Usain Bolt reaches 26 miles an hour at the Beijing Olympics, but Mr. McAllister claims that with modern training and spiked running shoes, an Aborigine man would be capable of 28 miles an hour. Meanwhile, Neanderthal women would win a battle of strength with Arnie because they had 10% more muscle than the modern European man. With some weight work in the gym, a Neanderthal woman would reach 90% of Schwarzenegger's bulk at his peak in the 70s. However, because a Neanderthal woman had a shorter lower arm, Mr. McAllister believes she would slam him to the table without a problem. The anthropologist blames modern lifestyles for our decline in speed and power. He says in his book, at the start of the Industrial Revolution, there are statistics about how much harder people worked then. The human body is very plastic and it responds to stress. We have lost 40% of the shafts of our long bones because we have much less of a muscular load placed on them these days. So, in contrary to what evolution is saying, it isn't a linear progression of man, it isn't a linear progression of the species. We're actually weaker now than we were before. So I just wanted to get into this for a minute. What we're getting now is actually a revisionist history of Neanderthal artefacts, because the evolution theory is actually under threat from all the things that they're finding out about what Neanderthals could do. The evolution theory itself is under threat because if there was no Neanderthal man and the Neanderthal man is valued as being behaviourally modern and a full human, then the evolution theory is under threat because they haven't found any missing links, and then therefore the Neanderthal man is much more advanced than evolution would have us believe, and it pushes further back advanced humans further and further back into history, so it gets harder for them to explain their first events and explain how it takes millions of years for things to evolve. If every instance of man that they look at is a behaviourally modern advanced being, then there's a big problem for them to fill in the gap and say at certain points in man's history he was a devolved, non-advanced being. So what we're getting is a revisionist history with things like this. I think it's the Daviji baby. It's a flute that was found, dated from 55,000 years ago during the Neanderthal times in Europe during the Ice Age, so it was the Neanderthal man. But they're trying to say now, because that's a threat to the evolution theory, they're having revisionist history and they're going back and they're trying to reanalyse it and desperately cling to the idea that it's not. So, was the first musical instrument just a chewed bone? Neanderthal flutes were made by hyenas, study claims. Researcher says a bone flute found in Slovenia is not an instrument. Instead, he says it is simply a bone chewed by a hyena with teeth marks. He claims all such instruments were made by hyenas and not Neanderthals, and the bones do not even originate from Neanderthal times. So, as I showed you previously, the modern human from 3.5 million years ago, they won't let anyone else analyse that data, and it's against the zoological code. Also to show you the trends that they're trying to do a revisionist history and rewrite man's history to make him into a less advanced being than he actually was. I'm just trying to show you the desperation of some of the scientists out there trying to desperately cling to the evolution theory, even although the trends, all the information that's coming out now, the trends are showing that modern humans go back millions and millions of years, which evolution says is not possible. So it was heralded as the world's oldest musical instrument, a bone with 2 holes in it, seemingly made by Neanderthals to serenade their companions, but now a study says it's not an instrument at all, but rather simply a bone chewed by hyenas and left in a cave. The research suggests historians have been fooled by these phony objects, and in fact all such instruments attributed to Neanderthals are simply chew toys of animals. So let's look into the detail of it. The Daviji Babe flute. If it is a form of flute, it is possibly the world's oldest known musical instrument. Alternative hypotheses notwithstanding, the artifact remains on prominent public display as a flute in the National Museum of Slovenia. The museum's visitor leaflet maintains that manufactured by Neanderthals is reliably proven. Researchers working at the site uncovered more than 600 archaeological finds in at least 10 levels, including 20 hearths. And as I showed you, using a hearth is behaviourally modern, so we're already getting indications that people who lived around this artefact were behaviourally modern, so it would make sense that they were interested in making art and music if they were behaviourally modern, having hearths as an example of that. The skeletal remains of cave bears and have studied climate change during the Pleistocene. According to the museum, the presumed flute has been associated with the end of the Middle Pleistocene and the time of Neanderthals about 55,000 years ago. This is not the only such site in Slovenia. In the 1920s and the 1930s, the archaeologists Reko Brodar discovered tens of bones with holes in another site in the eastern Kravankne, but almost all of them were destroyed during the Italian occupation in Libuggia in World War II. So it's not just the Davigi baby that is a flute. There were lots of other flutes that were found of a similar nature, but they were actually all destroyed in World War II. The hole spacing and alignment, the probability that 4 randomly placed holes would appear in a line in recognisable musical scale is on the order of a few in several million. So the chances of another random event producing these holes that are on exact par with how you would have to place holes for the standard 7-note scale in the Western world, then the chances of that are a few in a few million. So something similar to winning the lottery. According to an analysis made in 2000 by Canadian musicologist Bob Fink, responding to D'Errico's carnivore origin hypothesis, that's the fancy term for the hypothesis that a hyena came along and bit into that bone. He pointed out that the features common between the carnivore origin artifact and other chewed bones studied by D'Errico do not include the alignment of the holes. So he's saying the guy who's saying that it's just a hyena who's came along and bit into this bone, he's saying this guy cannot be thinking about how these holes are aligned, because these holes are aligned perfectly with the 7-note Western scale. There is also no evidence that the two holes could have been bitten at the same time. The tooth spans were analysed by all taphonomists concerned to see if any animals could bite 2 or more such holes at once. No match could be found to any known animal. If a match had been found, it could have been cited as a prima facie evidence that the holes were animal made. This was noted by Turk, that's the man who is proposing that it is a flute. Turk is the man who's proposing that it is a flute, and D'Errico is the man who's proposing that it was an animal who bit into it. But this guy's saying there is no match for any animal's skull that could have made all of these holes at once, and that is how it would have had to have happened if it was an animal that made it. In his monograph, and was also noted for the opposing hypothesis, holders Newell and Chase, in their article in the August 98 issue of Current Anthropology, holes in the specimen, wrote Newell, were almost certainly made sequentially rather than simultaneously, and that the distance between them has nothing to do with the distance between any 2 teeth in a wolf's jaw. So there are several people who are coming along and analysing this. Only D'Errico is saying that it was an animal who bit into it and made it, but several people are corroborating the original guy's estimation, the man Turk, and he's saying there is no way that if it was an animal that made it, all of the holes would have had to have been made at the same time. And he's saying the evidence shows that holes weren't made at the same time, and not only that, but the way the holes are positioned don't correspond to the jaw of any animal. The diatonic scale, Bob Fink claimed in his essay in 97 that the bones holes were consistent with 4 notes of the diatonic scale, do, re, mi, fa, based on the spacing of these 4 holes. The spacing of the holes on a modern diatonic flute, the minor scale, are unique and not evenly spaced. In essence, Fink said they are like a simple fingerprint. The Davigi baby bones holes matched those spacings very closely to a series of note holes in a minor scale. So when you're making the minor scale, do, re, mi, fa, the holes aren't spaced uniformly. The holes have to be spaced in a specific manner, and the Davigi baby matches that exactly. And as you can see here, there's evidence that there was a hole there, there's evidence that there was a hole there, we've got these 2 holes here. There's also evidence that there was a hole on the back which would have corresponded to holding it with a 5 fingers, and you can see how precise it has to be for it to be a flute, and the Davigi baby matches that exactly. But we're having a revisionist history of negative scientists who want to go back and have a revisionist history because it's threatening to their evolution theory that man was so advanced at such an early time. So another thing that I want to get into is, I've been saying a lot about man. One of the things that I would like to just talk about for a couple of minutes is, I think that some of the ideals that are coming out of feminism are based on this ideal that has been promoted through the evolution theory and by extension into culture itself, that women have always been under the heel of men. There's a prevailing kind of cultural story, ancient cultural story of the caveman bossing his women about, dragging his women about, getting him to make his dinner for him, etc, etc. But I think that is a complete fallacy. It's completely untrue and it's completely wrong, and I think that that has then, women have been made to feel like that they have been subjected to men's needs and men's physical power through the full history of time. But I'm saying that's not accurate, and what I'm saying is that during the time of the Neanderthal, it was probably actually fairer for women, and women would have been held in esteem because they were the people who reproduced the society. They were the people who had children, and having children would have been very important to societies then. And I just simply do not believe this ideal that women were dragged around by the hair and something like that. I think that's all totally fake and it's nonsense. What I'm going to go on to say here is that, again, I've been talking a lot about men and what men have done. What I'm saying is that women who had children during that time period of the world without the ability of advanced medicine, I think that that is the greatest achievement in human history. The greatest achievement of any humans is the women who had children during that time period of the world, because having children now is actually still a very difficult thing to do. So if you can imagine that you were having children in a time when modern medicine didn't exist, that must have been a very scary thing, and it was a very, very brave thing to do. So evolutionists or the modern society won't talk about this great achievement that was done a long time ago, and I think it's because they don't really want people to think about how difficult it must have been for so-called Neanderthal man, for want of a better phrase, to produce families. The ancient family unit that I'm saying was all modern human beings, and I just think only modern human beings could have the intelligence, the bravery, the wherewithal to produce successful families in such a harsh environment. So I'll show you some pictures of how women had children back in those days, which I consider to be the greatest achievement of all human history. Back in the days, it seems that all the representations are that women gave birth in a squatted down position, and sometimes up against the back of another woman. There's another image there of ancient depiction of childbirth with the woman squatted down. There's another depiction of ancient childbirth with the woman in the squatting position and another two women helping. There's another depiction of childbirth again, and a woman in a squatted position. But what I'm trying to say is that I think also men would have been important during the childbirth at that time, and I think that when they teach us about Neanderthals or tell us about Neanderthals, the supposition is that women were slaves to men, but I think during the time period of childbirth, I think men would have been much more involved then. They would have been very, very worried about their partners dying during childbirth. They would have been very, very worried about their children dying during childbirth. And I think that the men would have been much more involved, they would have been much more caring, they would have been much more wary in helping their wife during that time period. And it might have been a community thing, it might have been other women that came in and helped, but I think that men would have stepped up and would have wanted their partner to have all of the things around them that were necessary to have a successful family. And if you think that when we look back, and I was telling you that the population went down from 10 million to 5 million within 1,000 years because of the rise in sea levels, and I'm also saying that humans are a part of infinity, and that the people who lived like 3.5 million years ago or 4 million years ago were probably people who survived a massive extinction event then also, and that lots of humans died out. So if you had seen lots of humans dying out, other children, bringing more children into the world would have been the most important thing that you could possibly do. If you were human beings who had witnessed a mass extinction event, bringing more children into the world would have been the most important thing that you could possibly do. And obviously these people understood that was the most important thing that you can do, and they obviously did it successfully, and they obviously did it well, because we are all here now, and those people came through that very, very difficult time period. And I'm saying that the women are the heroes of that time period, but men also, I think, would have supplemented the care for the females and done the hunting and made the lifestyle worth living, but that the women are the genuine heroes of that time period. And obviously, so what I'm saying is that women would have probably have been on a pedestal during that time period, not subjected to men's needs and men's wants. I don't think that would have been the case. I think that women would have actually have been on a pedestal because they had an inherent value that they could actually produce children. Whereas a man's life would have had no inherent value. He would have been expected to go out and put his life on the line for his family, for the survival of his species, and rightfully so, and those people were right and they done everything correctly, otherwise we wouldn't be here now. So, were the women during that time period of the world, was it a greater achievement than the ancient Olympians? Yes it was. And were the women who lived and had children during that time period to repopulate the world after the extinction events, was that a greater achievement than the Spartans? 300 Spartans holding back 250,000 Persians at the gates of Thermopylae? Yes, it is. It is a greater achievement than that. Was women having children during the primal years of man a greater achievement than the Magna Carta? Yes it was, because no one would exist if those people didn't do what needed to be done. Was women having children during the distant eras of man greater than Alexander the Great and the empire that he built? Yes it was. And was women having children during the repopulation period of man millions of years ago, was that a greater achievement than what Genghis Khan done? And the Mongol Empire? Yes, it was. It wasn't cooler, because no one's cooler than Genghis Khan, but it was a greater achievement, because if those women didn't have children, no one on this planet would exist. And if the men didn't provide for their women and put their women up on a pedestal, no one on this planet would exist. So anyway, let's get on to now to show you what actual scientists are saying. This is the final few slides we're coming into now. So this is what science is actually saying. You've heard what I've said. I've said that humans are a part of infinity. They've survived several extinction events throughout the years. Modern humans go back millions and millions of years. I'm saying that modern humans go back into infinity. But the only evidence that we have actually found is from humans a few million years old. Science is saying that modern humans didn't exist until 200,000 years ago. The Neanderthal Man, for one reason or another, existed until 40,000 years ago, but the mainstay of science is trying to say that there's a sequential linear order of man stepping down from the trees, from being a monkey to then becoming slightly more advanced, going through several stages of being completely different species before he could become the modern human. But I'm not saying that. I'm saying that any era of man has existed, has always been a modern human, a behaviourally modern person. So the Neanderthal Genome Project is one thing that evolutionists would use to say that Neanderthals were different to humans. So the Neanderthal Genome Project is an effort of a group of scientists to sequence the Neanderthal genome. In December 2013, scientists reported for the first time a high-coverage genome of a Neanderthal. The genome was extracted from the bone fragment of a Neanderthal female from around 50,000 to 100,000 years ago, found in a cave in the Altai Mountains of Siberia. According to preliminary sequences, 99.7% of those base pairs of the modern human and Neanderthal genomes are identical, compared to humans sharing around 98.8% of base pairs with the chimpanzee. Other studies concerning the commonality between chimps and humans have modified the commonality of 99% to a commonality of 94%, showing that the genetic gap between humans and chimps is far larger than originally thought. So that counts into what I'm saying. There's all the trends and the evidence that are coming out now are actually disproving the evolution theory on a large scale, but you're not really getting to hear about it, and if you are getting to hear about it, it's reported in such a way that it would seem normal. So they're now saying that humans aren't as similar to chimpanzees as they originally thought. The researchers recovered ancient DNA of Neanderthals by extracting the DNA from the femur bones of three 38,000-year-old female Neanderthal specimens from a cave in Croatia and other bones found in Spain, Russia and Germany. Only about half a gram of the bone samples was required for the sequencing, but the project faced many difficulties, including the contamination of the samples by the bacteria that had colonised the Neanderthal's body and humans who handled the bones at the excavation site and at the laboratory. So I just want to talk about the sequencing and this idea about things matching to a high percentage, right? See if you compared the genes, if you sequenced the genes of an African man and a Chinese man, their genome sequence would not match 100%. Now does that mean that either one of them is not human? If you sequence the genome of an Aborigine and the genome of an Inuit, their genomes would not match 100%. Now does that mean that either one of them is not human? And if you sequence the genome of a white, ginger, European man, and then you sequence the genome of an African pygmy, their genomes would not match 100%, but it doesn't mean that either one of them is not human. So when they're talking about Neanderthal genomes being different to human genomes, that is because they were adapted to living during the Ice Age, and although one species can't change to another species, there is a variable range within all species. It's actually called DNA switches. Certain switches within a genome can be turned on or turned off, and they're actually finding that these switches are far more important than DNA itself. It's like DNA is the computer board or the central processor, but the DNA switches decides what is going to be turned on and what is going to be turned off. And Neanderthals were human beings. They weren't a subspecies or a different species, they were just human beings who had different DNA switches turned on to adapt to a different environment. So I'll quickly show you that now. The actual detail of it is far too expansive to get into, but DNA switches, okay, so genes make up only 2% of the human genome and were easy to spot, but the on-off switches controlling these genes were encrypted within the remaining 98% of the genome. Without these switches, called regulatory DNA, genes are inert. So the Neanderthal man just simply had different sets of genes switched on and switched off compared to us, the human beings who live now. But it doesn't mean that they are not human or we're not human. We're both human and we might not match 100%, but the actual significance of that is not of great significance at all. And that's how different humans can be. So as actually time has went on, this is the type of drawings and the type of depictions that you would have got of the Neanderthal man in the past, say at the start of the 20th century. This is the type of thing that they would have said, because evolutionists and scientists want there to be a regressed form of man that they can say, look, see, there was a gradual upgrade of man in human genetics, but I'm saying that isn't the case. Humans have always been humans. Neanderthals is just the word that is incorrectly used to describe humans who had pronounced genetics that were used to survive a cold climate. As time has went on, science has went on, it has had to continually upgrade its notion of what a Neanderthal was without basically having the guts to admit that they were wrong from the start. It hasn't done that. It hasn't said, right, okay, so Neanderthals have exhibited all aspects of behavioural modernity, so we are now going to have to change what we see the Neanderthal man as. Science has never been honest enough to describe that, and so this is the type of past that we're looking to. It suited their agenda and it suited their story to say that the Neanderthal man was completely regressed and perhaps only one, a few tens of generations, a few hundreds of generations away from monkeys, literally monkeys, but they have continually had to upgrade as they've found more evidence about what the Neanderthal man could do and what the Neanderthal man did, for lack of a better phrase. He wasn't a Neanderthal, he was just a human. They have had to continually upgrade what the Neanderthal man could do, but they've never actually had the guts to describe, look,
it's not a Neanderthal man anymore, it's not a separate species anymore. The only reason that they continue to push that agenda is in protectionism of the evolution theory. And there's a standard in science, and they work off of paradigms, and using paradigms, which would just mean their current best guess, their current best theory. Everyone assumes that that current best theory is correct because that is what allows them to continue moving forward and continue to ask questions about the physical world and develop science. Now, unfortunately, what's happened is there is an admittance that the current paradigm for man's origins and man's evolution has been proven wrong, and everyone in science knows that, but it has never really been announced in any specific way or promoted or advertised in an honest way, because, as I was saying, the protectionism of the evolution theory, because when they've looked into the past, the idea was that man came down from the trees because there was some type of extinction event that led the trees to be, there was a mass of trees in a jungle type environment, a thick Amazonian jungle type environment, but they've looked back, they can actually look back now and dissect the actual flora and fauna of the time that happened, because they expected the reason that man would have came down from the trees is to then survive in an environment where the trees were decimated, and it was an environment that was more on the ground and surviving on the grasses and the plants and animals that were on the ground. But they've looked back at the biodiversity at that time, and they have found that there was no event that led to a savanna environment. There was no such thing. So the thing that they say was the catalyst of man coming down from the trees, it never happened, and they know it never happened. But they continue to use that paradigm because it allows them to ask questions and continue on with the science, and that is their current best guess. So the thing about the Neanderthal man, again, that is a paradigm that they currently believe, that's their best guess, but as time is going on, the trends are showing that the Neanderthal man never existed, and it was a complex set of human beings who could do all the aspects of behavioural modernity. And if they could do all the aspects of behavioural modernity, which they could, then they were modern humans, no different to the people who live today. The only difference being that as time has went on and there has been no extinction events, man has found ways to record his knowledge and pass his knowledge on to a wider section of the world, and to pass his knowledge on to his ancestors a lot easier. And so in that sense, technology has advanced, but the actual human species has not. The human species has always been human, and it's false paradigms that are still being sold by science community. But maybe it's time that we allowed alternative theories to come through, and maybe it's time that people in science were honest and forthright and said that the Neanderthal man was a human being, he was behaviourally modern, he met all the standards of behavioural modernity, therefore he was human, and that pushes back the origins of man even further. If he was a modern human, for as far back as we look, human beings were always human beings, then the evolution theory has a big question to answer, because from what they say, it takes millions of years for something to evolve, and there would be a multiple number, dozens of intermediary species that would lead from man being a monkey up until man being a human being. But if every time that we look back into human beings and we find that they were always behaviourally modern, then it proves that there was no intermediary species, and that man has been fully formed with all the behavioural aspects and all the genetic aspects that we have now, but they were fully formed from the moment that man, from any evidence, as far back as we look, any evidence that we can find, man is always fully formed and always human and complex. Then there's a big question for evolution to answer there, because there are no intermediary species, and it disproves the idea that it would take millions of years for man to become fully complex and the fully modern human that we know of today. But the truth is that it always has been that modern species, and science is working off of false paradigms, but they know that they are, but the public perhaps don't. Look at this picture here. I mean, this picture here is, say, at the start of the 20th century,
that is how they would have depicted the Neanderthal man. As I'm saying, the trends are showing us that the Neanderthal man was extremely complex. He had spiritualism, he had aspects of religion, he had aspects of studying the stars and the planets, he had farming, he had jewellery, he had art, he was domesticating species. These are all incredibly complex things, and what I'm saying is that this was the re-emergence of man after an extinction event. It wasn't the origins of man, it was the re-emergence of man. So unfortunately for me and what I'm saying, because I'm not backed up by science, well, I'm trying to say that I am by going through it all, but I feel like everything that I say will be non-validated in the eyes of the viewer. So I'm just going to quickly go through it, because when you start then questioning, if I'm saying that Neanderthals weren't human, that's one aspect, but for me to then say that that is a question over the evolution theory, that's another aspect. I have made other videos in which I question the narrative of the evolution theory. The evolution theory in science that the public know about is neo-Darwinism, and even in science, neo-Darwinism is very controversial. Lots of people don't accept the full aspects of neo-Darwinism, but the public doesn't know that, but the public do accept neo-Darwinism because that is what the scientific paradigm is. But lots of people in science, and including myself in the videos that I've made, I question neo-Darwinism, and so I feel like when I say things, people can just always fall back onto the safety blanket that is, well, science doesn't believe that, and I'm not qualified to say these things. But as I've pointed out to people previously, there are amateurs in astronomy who have made thousands of discoveries. I'm sure there are amateurs in other aspects of science that have made discoveries, and if it wasn't for the work of amateurs just studying things and doing it in their own time, giving up their own time to do it, then science wouldn't have been pushed forward as it is today. So I'm saying that even though I'm an amateur and I'm not qualified, that I am well studied in this area, and I feel like what I'm saying does have validity, but I feel like I've got to validate every single thing that I say. So I'm just going to show a couple of quick slides, because when you start questioning evolution and the genetics, there's a whole set of complex questions that come up, and then from the answers of that, if you answer that question, then another complex question can be raised from the answer. But I'll just quickly go through now to finalise off this video. But certainly, whether you believe in evolution or not, certainly the aspects of the Neanderthal man not being human and being a completely different species is a false paradigm. So this is what I'm talking about here. I made a slide to go through propositions, and then there's secondary questions that come up from the answers to the questions. So the proposition is man was never a Neanderthal, and the answer to that is that there are examples of anatomically modern humans going back officially as far as 3.5 million years ago. So why was the Neanderthal man different then? And that's because of genetic variety within the genome. Species have the ability to adapt to varied environments, and this is then expressed through natural selection, where species who are better at surviving within that particular subsect of the environment will become the dominant progenitors and pass their genes on through breeding. So the Neanderthal man was different because of natural selection, and he lived in a winter environment for a very long time. So if species can change through natural selection, does that not mean then that evolution must be true? The answer to that is actually no, because most variation is an example of a change within a species. If a bird gives birth to a bird that's got different coloured feathers, or a flower gives birth to a flower that's got different floral patterns, or if a human being gives birth to an intelligent human being, or they give birth to a human being who needs glasses, then those are all examples of changes within a species, and those changes can never lead to a new species being born, because with each generation it's a completely randomised version of the genetics. Sometimes mutations can skip a generation. The thing about the natural selection is that evolutionists will say, well, mutations occur and then that then leads to a new species, but what they don't tell you is that mutations are actually harmful to the genome. I think it's estimated that 99% of mutations are actually harmful to the survival of a species, not a plus. So you might get a human who's born who's strong, you might get a human who's born who's more intelligent than most other human beings, but
again, that is never ever going to lead to a process where a human being could give birth to anything other than a human being. And the same goes for every single animal on Earth, or living organism for that matter. So what they don't say is that most of the mutations that are passed on from generation to generation are actually harmful, where if you required glasses, if you were colourblind, if you were born with a disability, all of these various things, these are all examples of mutations that are harmful to the genome, and those mutations do not help people to survive in the wild, and that is what evolution is all about. It's about surviving in the wild. So if mutations that you are given would make it less able for you to survive in the wild, then that's not a process, that's not a successful process that will then produce a completely new animal. So why do we have examples of new animals then? And that's because some species can breed and create hybrids. However, in the natural world, this is very rare, and only a few species within the entire spectrum of all living organisms can actually produce hybrids, and most examples of new animals created from hybrids are in fact examples of man himself domesticating a species. I'm being a bit disingenuous there, because domesticating a species and a hybrid are actually two different things, but what happens is, if man has domesticated the auroch and he's made it into a cow, and if man has domesticated the cock and he's made it into a chicken, and if man has domesticated the boar and made it into the pig, unfortunately, as it goes with science, the pig, the cow, the chicken, and other examples of species that man has domesticated, the dog, are all actually examples of a narrowed gene pool. When you breed an animal and you breed it towards the purposes that you want, then it actually narrows the animal's genetic stock. It doesn't verify the genetic stock, and in the real world, genetic variation is more powerful than a narrow genetic stock. So what man has done with the animals that he has domesticated is that he has narrowed the genetic stock. He hasn't varied it, and when the animal is narrowed, for example a cow, the auroch could survive in the wild. It could defend itself, or it could run away, or it could use its horns. There's various aspects of things that it could do to survive in the wild, but the modern cow, if you put that out on the African Serengeti, it would not be able to survive on its own. It can't run, it can't defend itself. There's nothing it really has. The cow, the pig, all of these things, there's nothing that they really have. The chicken, they are all dumbed down species, for want of a better phrase. They are all species that have been dumbed down for man's needs, and these species can no longer survive in the wild. And the dog isn't a great example, because dogs probably could survive in the wild on a kind of scavenger basis, but the dog was bred from the wolf, and the wolf can survive 100% completely on its own in the wild. But the way that they do that is that they form packs, etc, etc. So some species of dogs are very capable, and they probably could survive in the wild on a scavenger basis, but it is still a narrowing. The genetic stock of the dog is still a narrowing down from the wolf. It's not an example of a species becoming more complex, it's an example of a species becoming less complex, and pretty much all dogs are less capable of survival in the wild than wolves. So domestication and hybrids are not actually an example of evolution. So why are hybrids not an example of evolution? Because hybrids often have a weaker genome to pass on to their ancestors, and in fact many of them are actually infertile. So a lot of the hybrids, not talking about domestication anymore, a lot of the hybrids that can be created are animals that actually can't even reproduce sexually, and they often have a lot more medical ailment and problems with aggression than the natural species is. So some animals can create hybrids, but it's actually a weaker genome that they're passing on. And if you're passing on a weaker genome, again, it's a big problem for the evolution theory, because that's not a process. If you're continually passing on a weaker genome, or to the point that you actually cannot even reproduce, then that means that you're not fit for natural selection, and there's no way that is an example of a complex process that could create entirely new beings. So if a species is infertile, it cannot breed, and therefore it is not fit for natural selection, therefore it will inevitably die out, therefore it cannot possibly be an example of evolution, because evolution means the ability to adapt to your environment and survive. The additional aspect that most successful hybrids which can survive are animals which have been domesticated by man is not an example of evolution either, because man is an intelligent species who has intervened conditioned in his environment to change it, but evolution is the claim that species can evolve by completely natural means through an interaction only with breeding and the natural environment. Additionally, like other hybrids, domesticated animals have a weaker genome than their original ancestral species. So, as I said previously, any animal that man has domesticated is actually a narrowing of the genome. The genetic stock, it's not an increase or a variation of the genetic stock, so that's not an example of evolution. And another thing is that it's not something that, if man hadn't intervened in that process, the natural breeding of the animals, that would never ever have occurred, because it's an intelligent person who's actually disrupting the breeding process of the animals and intentionally making the animals that he sees of the aspects of what he wants. For example, the cow is much fatter than the auroch, and the chicken is much more tamer and dumb than the cock, because over years and years it's easier for man to have a species that is dumbed down and is fattened up for the meat that he wants to select. But those animals would find it very, very hard, if not impossible, to survive in the wild, and their genetic stock would never have reached that stage naturally through just chickens choosing their mates or aurochs choosing their mates. That process never ever would have occurred in the natural environment. It's only by the interception of an intelligent and outside intelligent species that process has occurred. So that's not actually an example of evolution, it's an example actually of intelligent design, which is what I promote. So what was the Neanderthal Man then, to finish this all off? The Neanderthal Man was an anatomically modern human being. However, after surviving in a winter environment for generations, it was a species of man who was adapted to Ice Age survival. The ice also pushed the living environment up to a high altitude because the ice covered the ground and forced man into a mountainous environment. Consistent with Bergman's principle and Allen's rule, the genetic difference could have become very pronounced over many generations. When specific sets of the genome are selected, the genome is actually narrowed, not increased, as we see with hybrid species. Genetic variety is better for genome expression and the survival of the species in general. However, in the Ice Age microcosm of the environment, it suited humans to be stocky, strong, have bigger noses for taking in the air, etc. However, they were no less capable and were a fully behaviourally modern human species. So that's what I'm saying, that the Neanderthal man, over generations and generations, the gene pool became very pronounced towards Ice Age survival, but it doesn't mean that they were an intermediary species between monkeys and human beings. What it means is that they were a set of human beings who had a narrowed down genetic stock after many, many years of surviving in the Ice Age, and that's all it was. But they were completely modern, and I have shown in these videos that they exhibited all aspects of behavioural modernity. Okay, and that's it. So thanks very much if you watched all of this. I congratulate you. It took a long time for me to research it all, and it takes a long time for me to put my ideas across, because I'm fighting against all the aspects of anti-intellectualism and science becoming the modern replacement of religion and the modern belief system without people actually going and investigating things themselves. If you reached this far, I thank you very much. If you still don't agree with what I say, that's fine, but I'm glad that perhaps there are people like me and other people like me who are pushing alternative ideas, because I think it's a form of intellectual freedom. And if you can at least try, because science hasn't found these answers, science is still looking for these answers, so I don't see why there should be an intellectual hierarchy in which I'm not allowed to try. Like, I feel like I'm allowed to try, and what I've said, I've tried to back it up as science as absolute best as I can. So thanks very much for listening, and have a nice evening. Thank you. Bye.
Well, this is 2009, and it's the bicentenary of Charles Darwin, and all over the world, eminent evolutionists are anxious to celebrate this, and what they're planning to do is to enlighten us on almost every aspect of Darwin and his life and how he changed our thinking. I say almost every aspect because there's one aspect of this story which they have thrown no light on, and they seem anxious to skirt around it and step over it and talk about something else. So I'm going to talk about it. It's the question of why are we so different from the chimpanzees? We get the genetics keeping on telling us how extremely closely we are, hardly any genes of difference, very, very closely related. And yet, when you look at the phenotypes, there's a chimp, there's a man. It's astoundingly different, no resemblance at all. I'm not talking about airy-fairy stuff about culture or psychology or behavior. I'm talking about ground-based, nitty-gritty, measurable physical differences. That one is hairy and walking on 4 legs. That one is a naked biped. Why? I mean, then if I'm a good Darwinist, I've got to believe there's a reason for that. If we change so much, something must have happened. What happened? Now, 50 years ago, that was a laughably simple question. Everybody knew the answer. They knew what happened. The ancestors of the apes stayed in the trees. Our ancestors went out onto the plain. That explained everything. We had to get up on our legs to peer over the tall grass or to chase after animals or to free our hands for weapons. And we had got so overheated in the chase that we had to take off that fur coat and throw it away. Everybody knew that for generations. But then, in the 90s, something began to unravel. The paleontologists themselves looked a bit more closely at the accompanying microfauna that lived in the same time and place as the hominids. And they weren't savanna species. And they looked at the herbivores, and they weren't savanna herbivores. And then they were so clever, they found a way to analyze fossilized pollen. Shock horror. The fossilized pollen was not of savanna vegetation. Some of it even came from lianas, those things that dangle in the middle of the jungle. So we're left with a situation where we know that our earliest ancestors were running around on 4 legs in the trees before the savanna ecosystem even came into existence. This is not something I've made up. It's not a minority theory. Everybody agrees with it. Professor Tobias came over from South Africa and spoke to University College London. He said, everything I've been telling you for the last 20 years, forget about it. It was wrong. We've got to go back to square one and start again. It made him very unpopular. They didn't want to go back to square one. I mean, it's a terrible thing to happen. You've got this beautiful paradigm. You've believed in it from generations. Nobody has questioned it. You've been constructing fanciful things on top of it, relying on it to be as solid as a rock, and now it's whipped away from under you. What do you do? What does a scientist do in that case? Well, we know the answer because Thomas S. Schoon wrote a seminal treatise about this back in 1962. He said, what scientists do when a paradigm fails is, guess what? They carry on as if nothing had ever happened. If they haven't got a paradigm, they can't ask the question. So they say, yes, it's wrong, but supposing it was right. And the only other option open to them is to stop asking the questions. So that is what they have done now. That's why you don't hear them talking about it, yesterday's question. Some of them have even elevated it into a principle, what we ought to be doing. Aaron Filler from Harvard says, isn't it time we stop talking about selective pressures? I mean, why don't we talk about, look, there's chromosomes and there's genes, and recall what we see? Charles Darwin must be spinning in his grave. He knew all about that kind of science, and he called it hypothesis-free science, and he despised it from the bottom of his heart. And if you're going to say, I'm going to stop talking about selective pressures, you can take the origin species and throw it out of the window, because it's about nothing else but selective pressures.